Okay. Yes. So,
shall I introduce Paul?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Paul. It's great to see you online. We're trying to figure out the time zones. There's a lot of hopping around at the moment, but hopefully it's at an okay time for you over in Australia. So I'm very happy to welcome Paul here today. Paul is Associate Professor at the University of Queensland and is leading scholar in strategy and qualitative research. His work identifies the relevance of theory and practice and how practice can inform theory. We were having a big discussion about this yesterday, so it's great to have your insights now. Paul's also led and been part of several research teams in the context of entrepreneurship, health, reinsurance, telecommunication, and the petrochemical industry, which is very interesting to see the broad range of applications of your work as well. Paul's work is at the forefront of theory development, in particular strategy as practice, and Paul has been a key member in terms of growing and developing that group, and hopefully we'll learn more about how to grow communities and learn more from strategy as practice as our community grows as well. So Paul's talk this morning is titled Social Practice Theory on Scholarly Domains, Fostering the Potential for and Trajectory of Entrepreneurship as Practice. Paul Spee, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ola, for such a kind introduction. And good morning or good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. You know, in this sort of strange part, right, where I'm really grateful to join today's EAP conference. It's always been on my list to join. I didn't think that I would, you know, prefer an online attendance, but given that this is the best we can do at the moment, very happy to be here. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with this. This is not about artifacts, but, you know, I did test positive a few days ago for COVID. So I'm, you know, because of the online facilities, I'm actually able to join. So I'm very, very grateful for that. Luckily, sort of fever somewhat subsided. Anyway, today's talk is really what I'm trying to do is to share a few reflections on the impact of social practice theory on different domains. As you know, Ola pointed out in a very kind and generous introduction, most of my work has been with, if you like, the field of strategy. But what I'm going to share, and I'll reflect on that or share a few more reflections in a little bit, I've taken up, if you like, the task to review the impact of practice theory across different domains. So whilst I'm really familiar with strategy, I guess having lived and breathed it myself, I was really intrigued to see what sort of, or how rather than what, but how practice theory has made an impact on other fields. And, you know, really fantastic to see EAP thrive and its momentum, you know, to sort of accelerate. Very sort of happy that Anna Jenkins, who's a very close colleague and friend of mine, she shared, you know, a copy of your forthcoming handbook. So I was really intrigued and read through quite a lot of the chapters. And, you know, also picked up that there have been literature reviews on EAP now and, you know, other book chapters and other work to really, if you like, flesh out the agenda of EAP. So what I'm trying to do is not to convince you of, you know, strategy as practice as such, but really to provide hopefully sufficient evidence and grounding of what has happened in other fields that can, in best case scenario, inform some of your discussions or even some of your writing potentially as EAP further develops. And for now, I guess I can only claim myself an outsider, even though I'm, you know, close in spirit with EAP. I'm sure that, you know, I will join forces at some point with all of you. I already alluded to it. There's really 2 points to my reflections. One is on the impact of practice theory, broadly speaking, and the second is to then apply some of that and to take an outsider's view on, you know, like EAP, you know, the movement, social movement, an academic movement, as well as, you know, the distinct orientation to entrepreneurial phenomena. By the way, so, you know, I'll just come back to this. I intend to speak for about 40 minutes. So hopefully that should leave ample of time, you know, at the end. If there's any burning question, maybe you could write it in the chat, you know. Having facilitators teaching, I'm not going to pretend that I'll monitor the chat, but maybe, you know, Sarah, Ola, or Neil will be able to sort of monitor the chat and share, you know, a burning question if or at whatever point it may arise. All right, so the promise of practice theory, and I guess this is also what brings you here, not just here as in the EAP conference, but, you know, close to practice theory, is that it actually allows, and I know a lot of attention was devoted to it in the first chapter of the handbook, and I think, you know, Ola alluded to it, that great discussions happen around the theory practice, I guess, divide. And this is one of, I guess, the novelties that practice theory offers, because it offers a blend, if you like, or, you know, it's practice, as in, you know, the grounded practice that we might be able to observe and give labels to, which will inform theory or the theorizing, but at the same time, it is that part of the theorizing that can actually inform practice. And Ola alluded to some of the, you know, examples or settings, that I, you know, conducted empirical research, if you like, in, so to speak. One of which is entrepreneurship. Anna convinced me that we should join forces, and I've had zero regrets since she made that suggestion. And, you know, in joining forces, I just wanted to share here quickly, just as an overview, this was our grant proposal, which got subsequently funded here by the Australian Research Council, which at the time made it almost impossible in the area of entrepreneurship across Australia, despite Per Davidson and, you know, the Australian Centre for Entrepreneurship, you know, making great progress, but even more so for qualitative research. So what I wanted to allude to here is, you know, precisely a demonstration of, you know, how, if you like, obviously framed here for more of a lay audience, how practice theory, in this instance called the practice-based approach, provides an intellectual, like onto epistemological, methodological approach to actually shed light on areas that practitioners or in practice that they're experiencing. Other examples to generate impact on practice from research was on the basis of long research, which was, you know, it was 4 years of actual ethnographic, deep qualitative research into the reinsurance industry, which Paula Jazepkowski had led, and I was part of for about half of that journey. So with that book, which we wrote, if you like, as a, you know, we wrote for an academic audience, but with a lay audience in mind. And, you know, on the basis of actually being able to unearth the practice of reinsurance trading and the fundamental shifts that happened to the trading practice, we were able to actually shape and make an impact on practice, or at least, you know, we're on the journey to at the time, through, for instance, journalists in the Financial Times, The Economist, picking up on it. And recently we were notified that even Spotify, you know, made an audiobook about reinsurance actually grew quite heavily from our book. Anyhow, to the more, I guess, serious and potentially interesting element is, you know, the work that I've been advocating on the basis of practice, just like you in entrepreneurship. I was really intrigued, and I commenced, I think from an evolutionary point, it's interesting to see, I commenced my doctoral studies in 2005, and at the time, the best citation to, if you like, strategy as practice, which hadn't yet really sort of labeled as such, was Richard Whittington's article in 1996. Only subsequently, Paula's book with the title Strategy as Practice actually appeared. So over time, and, you know, yes, you know, you're somewhat supposed to do that, and I wanted to give you a bit of an introduction to the work. What I've done is I focused particularly on elaborating and advancing insights on strategy as a social activity to this date, and, you know, a very, very close in physical proximity colleague of mine in strategy, you know, could still not wrap his head around what practices have to do with strategy, because all there was to it was really financial or econometric models to analyze strategy. So this, as many of you experience firsthand, I'm sure in your own institutions or even with supervisors, actually quite a radical view relative to where the other dimension to that relation actually comes from. In addition to elaborating on strategy as a social activity, some of you might be familiar with literature review that I conducted, which was actually part of my master thesis at the time, just because there was very little on, if you like, on actually trying to foster and channel all the different momentum that had been occurring in that very nascent field at the time or area of research called strategy as practice. Beyond that, I've also explored in more recent publications, you know, the benefit of adopting practice, a focus on practice to, if you like, explicate institutional theory and additional pillars here of institutional theory. If you're interested, that piece, the most recent piece with Mike Lansbury and Deborah Anderson, there's an edited volume in the Research Sociology of Organizations, also features Roger Friedland and Ted Schatzky in a bit of a debate on, if you like, the role of logics or norms in institutions in general. And this is really why I wanted to come back to the book. We're able, with the book, to theorize market making as constituted in nested relationalities. And I really wanted to bring up this notion of nested relationality because I also picked up that this featured quite prominently in a lot of the recent EAP work to, you know, sort of, I guess, conceptualize venturing, as in venture emergence, as nested and as constituted in relationalities. So here you might find some interest for those of you who would like to explore the notion of nestedness and relationalities in a bit more detail. All right, but really, so I wanted to give that as a way of background, because most of you are probably less familiar with me or with my work as such. So just wanted to give you a bit of a heads up in the sense that, you know, I'm if you like, fully convinced, and I don't need to convince you of, I guess, the benefits of social practice theory, but yet, I guess, it couldn't be claimed as advocating EAP as such. So why am I going now? And I just wanted to, I guess, give a bit of a preface here. So I was invited to write an introductory book to practice theory. And then I thought, well, Davide Nicolini and others, they've done a really fantastic, and Sylvia Garud have done a fantastic job in doing that. There's no point in, if you like, flooding the market with something similar. And so what I'm referring to is a recent book, which I'm hoping it actually will be published in 2022, because I had quite a few pivots. So I do feel in that sense that, you know, writing does remind me of what I guess the struggles entrepreneurs go through on occasion. Actually, yeah. Now, the point there is, and this is to my most recent pivot, and since it was 2 years ago, I think I'll stick with wherever the pivot ended up and landed. It was really to demonstrate, well, what is the impact, the broader impact of social practice theory to, if you like, management and organization theory more broadly, with the assumption here that management and organization theory, and for this I would include entrepreneurship, I would include strategy, and I would include other areas. They are just, you know, different, if you like, fields of research or silos. And I was interested to actually see, where did the seeds of social practice theory, where did they, if you like, make an inroad into academic debates, and to unpack how. And that's what I'd like to share some light on in sort of the next 10 minutes, and then I'll sort of switch the lens to EAP and the potential learnings. Interestingly enough, so I took a sample of 6 journals, those 6 journals that were around, you know, in the 1950s, ASQ, AMJ, Org Science as the North American basis. And then I took Organization Studies, Human Relations, and Journal of Management Studies. And I was interested to run the same sort of like test parameters. Now, the first publication here of, and by the way, this is of mentions, and I guess it will come up in a minute, of those social practice theorists that feature very prominently in EAP. That's the work of Verduijn, Giddens, Schatzky, Wittgenstein. The first actual publication dated back to 1977. Authors we've never heard of. No credit, if you like, been given to. But anyway, over time, though, what was curious is really the, if you like, the trajectory here, and these are, 2-year intervals here. It shows that over time, there's been literally that wave and influx of, of work that was influenced by practice theory. As I said, these are just those 6 journals. But then what becomes more interesting, and I'll just take this as a way of background, is not only the split here with Giddens and Bourdieu having the biggest impact consistently across these 6 journals, but to actually see, that for some journals, it probably remained niche, a very niche, if you like, orientation to scholarly work, whereas for others, in particular organization studies and human relations, one could argue it's probably part of their core, if you like, academic discourse. What is core? The work, if you like, the origins of work in social practice theory. Of course, today I just wanted to equally preface, there's the wider practice turn, there is additional lenses, Raghu, Garud, and Pascal are talking about performativity, which wouldn't be classified as social practice theory, but I would probably still go as far as to suggest that it is within the broader practice term. Right. So again, I just wanted you to sort of to preface this point. So now what are the actual examples? And I don't like when you take, for instance, some of the recent work, that if you like the syntheses on EAP, right? The broader introduction around what are practices, why is a focus on practices different? That is very consistent to, if you like, the nascent work that introduces social practice theory to, say, strategy, to information systems, to accounting. So there's huge similarities. What I'm trying to point at here, and I know there is probably insufficient time to sort of dwell on it in detail, because the point is not really to offer too much detail today, but to really, if you like, remain at that zooming out level on if you like, our own domain. So if we focus on strategy as practice in information systems, and in the book I'm also drawing on, even though you can't probably call it a legitimately equivalent domain, which is the focus on knowing and learning. But if you're drawing on, sort of how has social practice theory impacted, if you like, the area of strategy? Strategy as practice could now be classified as a field of research itself. In information systems, on the other hand, social practice theory has, if you like, co-evolved with the broader field, whereas, and that's really the big point, whereas strategy as practice is almost and has become a semi-standalone academic discourse. Now that to me is really where I see these 2 different trajectories, and I'm just planting the seed, I'll come back to it later. That to me is really something that you, as everyone within EAP, might like to sort of consider or bear in mind. Should EAP become a distinct field similar to strategy as practice, or what are the potential paths, benefits, drawbacks, whatever one might call it, to actually be potentially similar to what happened in information systems, where it's more of a co-evolution. So here, the first couple of bullet points really, I guess, give you some indication of, so what's novel, right? What has social practice theory afforded strategy scholars, those interested in strategy? Strategy is deemed a situated, socially accomplished activity. In information systems, what really, that dates back to the 1970s, 1980s, what really made a difference there is the status and the relationship between the technology, that information technology, and the human interactions. Similar to if you're reading a lot of Ted Schatzky's work, and I think it's equally featured in his chapter, the societist versus the individualist perspective, and if you like, how one conducts research on the basis of it has really sort of been broken free or removed by through the introduction, leveraging the work of social practice theory in information systems. So for strategy here, and that strategy is practice, if you like, practice theory, and here I'm at the sort of the last part of the bullet point. It provided the basis to establish distinctly new lines of inquiry, and that's an emphasis I really wanted to make, because relative to the strategic management field, they're radically different, and to many, they're not recognized as equivalent. Right, so it's a point here of legitimation, and how legitimate is it, not for the community itself, but if you like, for those deemed as representative of the broader domain, as in strategic management in this particular example. For information systems, again, I'm here referring to the last bullet point, practice theory was seen to generate complementary insights, and that was more or less from the get-go by the way or by way of how practice theory was introduced in particular work. Again, a point I'm coming back to. But what I wanted to plant the seeds on is that these two, obviously, those few minutes that are shared here might not have given sort of too much substance to it, but there is variation in how legitimate practice theory is deemed within the broader sphere, right? I'm talking about, if you like, an eagle's eye or bird's eye view on the development of practice theory within a specific domain. That difference and that stark difference comes out in my next juxtaposition, and that juxtaposition is, again, applying the same search terms, for Giddens, Bourdieu, Wittgenstein, Schatzky's work in domain-specific journals. The first slide on the overview, where it's, the 6, if you like, more or less generic management journals. Now I'm applying the same search to the domain-specific journals. And here, with regards to strategy and strategy as practice, you can tell it's minuscule here. The relative mentions in long-range planning and the strategic management journal, especially relative to strategic organization. Many of you in the strategy area, or those of you who have some familiarities, strategic organization was a new journal established in 2001 to reintroduce, if you like, the connection to organization theory. Now in information system, very interesting here is you've got the equivalent journals, right? And SMJ, the Strategic Management Journal, Long-Range Planning, they take similar status as Journal of Business Venturing and Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice in Entrepreneurship. And so in the information systems domain, does Management Information Systems Quarterly, MISQ, ISR. But when you look at the relative, obviously the bars here don't suggest it, but when you look at the relative percent of mentions, here it's 5%, that's this bar, whereas here, on the other hand, it's 0.5%. So the point I'm trying to make here, without over elaborating, the point is that the legitimacy of practice theory is already quite evident when looking at the representation, even though the relative representation of work that was influenced by practice theory towards the broader corpus of work published in these journals. With these journals, right, being the gatekeeper of debates and insights that actually matter. So then what else can we learn from, if you like, reflections in particular of the strategy as practice domain? Why the strategy as practice domain? Because it is like distinct. It had to become distinct in order to actually become a particular field of research. And maybe this is where some of the similarities to EAP could be, as in EAP might need to, and already has, made itself the claim for novelty, because there might not have been sufficient, if you like, connections that were allowed to be made within, if you like, the gatekeepers of the mainstream field. So strategy as practice, has had a recent piece, a reflective piece that I literally came across a week ago, because it's forthcoming in Human Relations, where they are looking at the different phases of development of the domain of strategy as practice. And here, you've got a broader spread of the different journals that have actually published work on strategy as practice. And you can see, whilst it is unfortunate, you know, it's just one to bear in mind that you know, the strategic management journal still resides relatively low in that. But so back to the phases of development, and that's something that EAP and, you know, the broader community and yourself might like to take into consideration as you are conducting your research and writing your next, if you like, either essay, literature review, or you're trying to position your, you know, EAP within your thesis. So the phases of development, you know, that led to, if you like, this is all retrospective here, commenced with the germination, the agenda-seeking work. It then moved into blossoming, the agenda-setting work. And in both of these, if you like, phases, and again, the point is not how long these phases lasted for, because, you know, this is really where each and every domain and scholarly field is different. But in both of these, what was quite a common characteristic, it was that, you know, as per the reflection by the authors, that to publish work on strategy practice, one had to continuously justify and defend why practice theory is needed. What's the novelty? Whereas once it shifted into the harvesting phase, what they refer to as the agenda confirming work, one could actually take for granted and state, well, I'm conducting strategy as practice-based research in order to do X, Y, and Z. One no longer had to actually justify why practice theory was novel and required. And now, if you like, the future phase for strategy as practice is propagating, as they refer to it, which is, you know, referring to agenda expanding work. But where I saw additional, hopefully, connections to maybe each of your work that you're currently writing is, you know, to work out the relationship of practice theory to the broader debates that are actually happening within entrepreneurship, and your willingness to contribute to them or to take them as a starting point, as well as the willingness of the gatekeepers of that domain to actually find it novel or be receptive for that sort of work. So one could, and this really refers to now practice theory relative to, you know, is it more of a psychological slant or an economic slant to entrepreneurship? Are you going to contrast it, as in, you know, to juxtapose? Why is practice theory different? On what basis? Or would it be to actually make the argument more on a complementary basis, as in, you know, the area has always looked at X, but Y, not that Y is necessarily in stark contrast, but Y offers something new. So what I'm trying to do here is to give you a little bit of, I guess, a bit more rope here to hopefully, you know, grasp and sort of reconcile the difference between making an argument with regards to just, you know, contrasting one with the other, or to actually make more of a complementary argument. Lastly, one can make this combinatory sort of line of argument, but where the contrasting, complementing, and combinatory, I guess, distinctions are coming from is also referring to the evolution, sort of, you know, sort of zooming out again from constructing contributions, to actually demonstrate there is different points that a novel lens is deemed legitimate within the field itself. So the contrasting point is required, and I think, you know, EAP has probably done that already, or is past that point rather than done it, is past the point of developing distinctiveness and the research agenda, right, in its strive for legitimation. How? On the basis of, you know, contrasting it with other approaches to entrepreneurship. Now the question is, you know, where are the points of, if you like, common interest or connection with that scholarly debate in entrepreneurship to establish complementary insights, if you like, with it's almost like incremental. And on that basis, once it's been recognized, as I said, I'm referring here and inferring to EAP on the basis of the strategy as practice example. Right? Once recognition from, the other side of the community, in your case, the entrepreneurship community, the broader entrepreneurship community, once they recognize that this complementarity actually offers novelty, as opposed to the novelty just, stemming from like affirmations within the community as an EAP, that will then lead to combinatory and therefore joint research agendas, joint in the sense of, bringing to bear the different orientations that one no longer has to defend or justify the differences for. All right. Now maybe I'll pause here briefly. Are there any sort of burning questions potentially on any of my previous musings, I guess?
So far, there is nothing in the chat. But
okay, thank you, Thomas.
Somebody wants to ask openly. I don't see any hands, so perhaps you just continue, Paul.
That's all good. Yep. So now I'm to take this as an outsider's perspective on the EAP. So I try to sort of, I guess, center and anchor, what is EAP trying to establish in this particular quote. And I'm sure there would have been, better ones, no doubt, or more elaborate ones, if you like. But I thought this really captures what I felt made EAP distinct, and also gave me an entry point to if you like, to share 3 considerations to further the potential of EAP. So the creative and collaborative organizing of activities, that seems to really resonate and stem from, like, a focus on entrepreneuring, which, I guess has been sort of, circulating and been developing for quite a while. But it is precisely in that very close relationship to entrepreneuring and, if you like, the, the aspirations of EAP, that I thought there is some potential for actual clarification. Now, why are there some potential areas for clarification? Because one of the risks of practice theory, and if you like, the adoption of practice theory, and that is equally and had been a huge criticism of strategy as practice research, because one has to still avoid the trap of individualism. Why? Because it is individuals, it's their activities one is actually observing and studying. So therefore, there is some slight nuances with regards to the theoretical framing, but in particular, how one presents and analyzes empirical data, where one could slip into without necessarily obviously wanting to, or ontologically necessarily feeling one does it, but one could easily slip into that trap of individualism to demonstrate and reduce it down to the individual or that particular moment or context. So that's so my considerations here to further the potential of EAP is really to, I guess, just flag that there is that trap, which has been well established in other areas, obviously not necessarily for EAP, but therefore there's potential learnings here. And I'm going to highlight 3 particular areas. So one I sort of semi-alluded to, and that's really the conceptual clarity of practice and entrepreneuring. And each of these points I'm going to like to shed some light on a bit more. Another one is to extend the theoretical lens that one can actually adopt in order to shift away from individuals, right? And the one that I'm introducing is routines. And another is, what are the implications for the methodology, drawing on process analysis. And that process analysis, very, if you like, that shares the origins of process ontology and philosophy, which, is where Chris Dyer's work and Tochernis and others, and Daniel Kjot would be coming from. So here, EAP and entrepreneuring. What was curious, actually, and I wanted to do, a bit of a poll, but I decided not to, is the relation Like, how many times do you think entrepreneuring was mentioned in the handbook? So thanks to Anna, I had an electronic copy available. It's 293 times across 350 pages and 20 chapters. Now, entrepreneuring, I went back to Chris Starrett's work, was a conceptual attractor to accommodate the increasing interest in process theories within a creative process field. But, right, and here's the risk of just continuing with necessarily that contractual attractor label without necessarily, if you like, reflecting too much on what is actually being communicated, especially with regards to the relation to practice. Because there's nothing worse than reifying a new label that has huge potential, as I think we all believe entrepreneuring would have. But, and this sort of came across, or I came across, entrepreneuring has been seen as a perspective, could be seen as an umbrella construct. So there is a lot of fuzziness around. And when I looked at it, I identified variation in the relation of practice and entrepreneuring. And here I'm drawing on Sylvia Garadi's work, where she looked at the relation of knowing and practice in work she published in 2006. And I thought it was really quite relevant here to look at, is the relation of practice and entrepreneuring one of containment? And some of this, you might like to ask yourself as you're doing your work and you are engaging with the concept entrepreneuring and practice. So here, entrepreneuring is different from the practices because it is in the situated practices where one would claim to theorize entrepreneuring. Another one is the relation of mutual constitution, where they're not this, if you like, they're distinct, but they are recursively related, entrepreneuring and practices. But one would still refer to entrepreneuring and practice separately. The third relation is the relation of equivalence, where there is actually no difference between entrepreneuring and practice. It is through the practice that one studies entrepreneuring. Again, I just wanted to, I guess, share this with you, perhaps for some of you, as a point of reflection for your own work. Again, there is no better or worse, do it the right way, do it the wrong way. But I guess the point I picked up on is that at the moment, it seems, a bit of everything, sometimes even within the same author thesis. The other element I wanted to shed some light on is to extend the theoretical lens. So why do I follow, or why did I focus on routines? So routines, I mean, obviously, or not obviously, but I'm well familiar with routine dynamics as a field of research. But why do I feel it is an actual theoretical lens that could extend EAP? Why? Because routines have been deemed essential, to actually explain the growth of firms. This goes back to, foundational writings of Schumpeter, Penrose, and other economists. But I'm referring to routine dynamics specifically because that is a stream of research that has been informed by practice theory. Here, Martha Feldman and Brian Pentland's work really offer a novel perspective on routines and conceptualization of routines that was informed by a blend of Giddens' Structuration Theory and Bruno Latour's work on actor network theory. The routines are defined as repetitive, recognizable patterns of action. So here, what's the relation to avoiding individualism? One is not focusing on the individual per se, but on the pattern of action, whilst recognizing that these are performed by actors, but it might not necessarily just mean individuals, could equally be artifacts, technology, and the like. Again, I don't want to go into a lot of detail here. I just wanted to give you some broad sort of gist of what does it offer. It offers to focus on these interdependent streams of action on the basis of differentiating the ostensive aspect and the performative aspect. So the ostensive aspect informs the performative. This is where, those of you familiar with Giddens' Structuration Theory will recognize the recursiveness. The ostensive informs the performative, as in it guides, refers, and accounts for what action ought to come, but it doesn't determine it, right? Which means that in the performance, in that performative aspect, one could still make changes which could alter the actual ostensive aspect of a routine. So I thought, you know, I was digging in some of my work and I thought, well, can I actually make an example of how could one apply that? You know, I haven't done it obviously myself, so I'm just, you know, drawing on an inference of my work. So this here is you know, one of the published works on routine theory, and what you can see here and highlighted in this red circle, it focuses on skillful accomplishment. It doesn't state here, you know, behavior or, you know, an individual's action. So it recognizes that there is skill involved, expertise, which resides, or if you like, which is performed by individuals. But what it does, it looks at, you know, different dimensions and tensions, which I could see may play out in entrepreneurial ventures, which is one, you know, how do I get, you know, consistency across whatever I'm trying to, you know, get off the ground, whilst retaining flexibility and creativity, which is, you know, an equally inherent element to establishing or growing a venture. So that creative process and the organizing, if you like, are really firmly cemented here in the work of routine theory, not at two separate ends, but really as two different tensions. Now, unfortunately, you know, as happens so often, this is an, if you like, this is one of those many unpublished diagrams that you will, I'm sure, either have already compiled or might be compiling. What I thought I'll do is, what this does is so this research, sorry, you know, this overview really underpinned and sort of was a prerequisite to coming up with this very sort of neat and abstractive model. But it's really grounded in our observations of reinsurance professionals, where there were, just like in any organization, there's lots of different routines that are happening. And there was one core artifact that actually underpinned and was the central kernel to a lot of that activity. Now, that was a simple spreadsheet, but nevertheless, it really shaped, if you like, that whole endeavor of, you know, that skillful accomplishment of actually reinsurance trading. Where I thought the relationship here could be, or the inference to, you know, growing a venture, is there must be multiple different routines or attempts to establish routines that are happening in an entrepreneurial venture. I'm somewhat familiar with, at least from an empirical basis, observing, you know, startup companies that are in accelerators and trying to, you know, establish themselves post the accelerator experience. So here, potential routines could be focused around testing the MVP, the product development, and so on and so forth. That error in the middle of you know, that original sort of, or the piece that that was generated on the basis of the reinsurance industry. You know, that artifact here could equally be an evolving pitch or pitch presentation. So anyhow, so this is where I just wanted to, I guess, allude to some potential for routine dynamics as an additional theoretical lens, fruitful lens in, you know, shaping the EAP endeavor. Another one really takes us to the methodological toolkit. And, you know, I recognize I'm 40 minutes in, and I sort of knew that going into it, and sort of, I don't want to go into any of these details on that particular slide. I just wanted you to know where this is coming from, where's the relationship to, if you like, other streams of onto epistemology that underpin EAP. So this is squarely in line with the process, philosophy, and ontology that features and has, you know, informed Schot's work, Steyer's work, and is equally right, or Dimov's work. So it's very closely aligned with it. But what's the novelty, and what's the impact here on methodology? What I'm going to introduce very briefly, and I wanted to come back to it. Why am I introducing it? Because it is to avoid the trap of individualism, right? Which is, once you conduct it here, right? So what is the prerequisite, if you like, for that analysis is to actually have had, the ability to actually capture, if you like, process in its ontological sense, to capture that empirically through observations, through repeated interviews, through other diary methods, or whatever else it might actually be. But the focus, and this brings me here to the most right-hand side of the slide, is really to focus on analyzing the phenomenon as it was still in the flow. And that's the hardest part. Why? Because we as researchers, we are at the end of that process. So therefore, we are now required to analyze it, but as we're depicting it, we will need to go back to, and if you like, rewind to where the process actually began from. And we need to depict it in that sort of way, as if the outcome of that process that we know, because we are in that supposed future that we're going to construct, we need to help the reader to see and to lead them to that very same future. So that might all sound very esoteric, I figured. So I'm again drawing on a couple of examples in just a minute. But what I wanted to focus on is and this draws on work, I think I just wanted to allude to it, of a book chapter I wrote with Paula, Joseph, Jane Lea, where we actually took some of our work because we had realized, or other colleagues pointed us to the novelty that that we were actually making and helping to advocate for process ontology based on empirical research, whereas mostly it had been sort of just conceptual or philosophical. So what we identified in terms of analytical strategies is, and we mapped this onto different empirical phenomena. So one we refer to as a scripted pattern. So these are the patterns that one could observe. So the example where it originated from was strategic planning process. So as you know, there is a specific script one has to follow. But now one could simply say, well, this is the script and it was followed, or one could actually unpack what does it actually do as, if you like, to the discussions or to the future direction that is being discussed as part of the strategic planning sequence workshop, and to unpack that, going into those moments. Now, what did I think was a potential analogous scripted pattern in entrepreneurship? I thought pitching. Pitching is pretty rigid. I could imagine that if one rocks up at a pitching competition and doesn't follow, the particular norms, one probably doesn't even get through, the first 3 minutes of their pitch before being booted off the stage. Another strategy focus is on an emerging pattern. So what's an emerging pattern? That is a pattern where from the outset, if you like, there is no guide, right? One is literally just in the code as a researcher, as well as those practitioners or, those that one is observing as they're experiencing. A pivot, right? A pivot is usually just thought of in retrospect. And oh my God, the entrepreneur knew it all along. I'm sure it's hugely, but I mean, uncertainty is a huge concept, but I'm just using it sort of in layman's terms. It's hugely uncertain. One doesn't know what's going on. So that I thought really a good example of an emerging pattern. And a pattern in the moment, that is really, I guess, more to decide what is a pattern in the moment, whereas the first two, they're really, I guess, driven a little bit by the characteristics of what one is observing. The pattern in the moment speaks to, and is really in the eyes of the beholder of a researcher to actually unpack the minute details, which though, everyone can unpack, minute details, which though have to be connected to, the broader theory. Some of you might ask, well, how do you actually do it? So I thought I'll just show some quick examples. These are from the work that I illustrated at the bottom of the previous slide. We used narratives, which we developed on thick descriptions to actually theorize. So this pretty model, if you like, or the mechanisms to actually balance competing logics, which is where that argument is positioned within, came from these minute details, right, of observing and watching people, in their daily sort of how they go about their daily routines. Another one here, and this is really particularly focused on conversations, is to unpack the sequence of these conversations as they happen, right? So to allow the reader to actually to experience the flow of what actually happened. From there, it is identifying, in this paper we call it microprocesses, in the previous one I illustrated we called it mechanism, and to come up with different variations of what is the impact here. To then go a step further to actually say what matters. So here, you can see in the blue squares that appeared, this is how we developed, if you like, the relationships between these different concepts, just as examples. It's got very little to do with EAP, I recognize, but this is just, if you like, or the idea was to, share some of the examples of the work. So what are some considerations then on the basis of what we discussed? I think there's tremendous potential for EAP. I guess the question I was having is, how important does entrepreneuring remain in its further development? Does it, is it to be extended? Is it elaborated? Or, maybe, identify a different, it's nothing about an umbrella construct, but something that might be more anchored and closer to EAP than, if you like, to, whatever it had become, that concept of entrepreneuring. As the potential trajectory develops, there's additional theoretical lenses. I mentioned routine theory today, and tomorrow as part of your conference, you're hearing other lenses. They equally, offer novelty. I guess what I wanted then to leave you with is, what's the aspiration? Could EAP become a distinct field? Similar to strategy as practice, what are the potential points of common interest, though, to develop complementary or even combinatory insights? With, like, not the domain of entrepreneurship, but specific scholarly debates and streams of research that might be situated more closely in that entrepreneurship domain. And I guess another question, that I just wanted to pose is where's the phase of development? Where should it be heading? Is it in that blossoming phase? That's still the the agenda setting stage, or is it actually in the harvesting stage, where it's about actually having an established body that is now time to actually, if you like, shift gears slightly and decide, well, it's no longer about defending our difference and justifying it, but let's just move on, treat it as a status quo. But then again, coming back to the earlier point, to do what, right? To precisely, identify what particular entrepreneurial phenomena or theoretical insights. Again, these are just genuine questions to hopefully, shape some of your thoughts or discussions during the next couple of days. I guess one risk, and that's what is to be observed in the strategy as practice example, is identifying a distinct field could run the risk of isolation, being isolated from the entrepreneurship domain, which therefore, as it was shared and experienced within strategy as practice, on occasion it could be seen as bifurcating or dividing the field, and then being seen as counter to the actual aim to foster sort of beneficial scholarship. Then lastly, something we usually should talk about at conferences, because there's rarely an opportunity to do so in sort of our own writing, is to actually look at the research infrastructure. So what is the current research infrastructure? I mean, EAP, I think as a conference, annual conference in particular, is fantastic. But what are the other potential, if you like, points to an infrastructure that actually foster the development of the next generation of researchers, as well as to actually sit down over you know, a hot or a cold beverage to discuss, you know, where do we think the field is at in terms of, you know, the phase of development? Where do we feel we could be going? But it requires that platform for interactions. And, you know, here a bit of self-advertisement, you know, it's also about leveraging, or potentially doing more about leveraging developments, you know, with other like-minded communities, you know, and here I'm advertising a symposium that Neil, Sarah, and Anna were instrumental in making sure we're getting, you know, the entrepreneurship view and perspective to actually, you know, pick up on conversations we started a few years ago to look at, you know, the strategy and entrepreneurship. Is it, you know, two sides of the same coin, and posed very provocatively. And lastly, and I guess this is something, you know, that I just wanted to share with you with regards to legitimating a particular stream of research and a novel perspective. It is about, you know, where, not from necessarily from a career, you know, progression or development, but about the development of the field. It is about recognition, getting recognition of where it actually appears and is published. And here I'm coming back to that overview, and I looked at entrepreneurship theory and practice in journal and business venturing, and, you know, again, these relative scores of, you know, the dimensions of Bourdieu and Foucault, and there is already existing work that one might not actually think of as, you know, being closely affiliated with EAP, but they might provide entry points into debates that, you know, are happening in these journals as opposed to in the field that, you know, you might like to connect with in order to elevate and steer EAP and its trajectory forward. And this concludes my my reflections and my keynote. So thank you again. And whilst going over my own set time, I'm still, you know, there's still a bit of time for questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's very enjoyable. It's also, thank you so much for the extent of research you've done in preparation for the talk as well. I think it's great to have had someone drill down and show us how practice has materialized in the journals and those trends over time, and also for reading the handbook and identifying key terms emerging through that. And that whole discussion and the difference between entrepreneurship as practice and entrepreneuring. We had a big chat about that yesterday at the PhD day as well. So I think you've helped clarify some of the questions that were emerging from that we ourselves were struggling with and grappling with as well. I'd just like to ask anybody, I had to change devices there midway through, so I can't see previous chat, but does anybody have any questions that they'd like to raise to Paul at this stage? We still have a few minutes before our time is up. If you want to pop them into chat or turn on your mic or raise a hand. Tobias, yes, please.
Yeah, just jump in. So thanks for this very interesting conversation, Paul. Our presentation. So I was just wondering about this whole pragmatism and practice. So how would that be merged? Because I'm struggling with that quite a bit for my own PhD paper, and I just would be very curious as to your thoughts, because it makes sense, but then how would it look like concretely? Maybe you have some ideas.
Great question.
Look, can it be merged? I think I would treat them as similar in origin, and in long conversations that I had with Ted Chatsky, he introduced me to the French pragmatism and the American pragmatism. So that's about as much as I know about it. But look, I know a little bit more, obviously, but I think here, and there's different views on this. Davide Nuccolini likes to, I guess, have more of a, and Silvia Garudi, I think more of a blended approach, a mix and match approach from different, if you like, theoretical or philosophical traditions. If we treat pragmatism and practice theory as, you know, between philosophy and theory, you know, I probably am a bit more of a stickler for consistency to one. So I would probably, you know, either adopt a pragmatist perspective or a practice perspective. If not, if one wants to combine, it's really the question as to, you know, as to why both are necessary. They both have, you know, their, what do you want to call it? They've got their specific emphasis, right? It's not about better or worse. It's just a question of emphasis. And then the question is, you know, how do you leverage that emphasis for what you wanted to do? right? And there might be one that might work better for, I don't know, shedding light on X, you know, in your data or for your sort of research. And, you know, for another chapter, there might be Y, it might be different. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question here, but rather than, you know, trying to bring it all in, I think it's simply a question, or I guess that's what I'm posing to you, is a question of what does each offer, and that will then give you the answer of whether they can be combined or whether you would like to retain them as separate.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's also like interesting to understand, maybe I should go back a bit to do that. What are the benefits of each of these, say, perspectives, because they're not a theory, neither SAP nor pragmatism, like, so they can all be merged with a theory, like evolutionary theory or something, but they're not a theory by themselves. But what do these perspectives offer to enrich a theoretical perspective? I guess that's something I'm going to think about.
Exactly, and this is, you know, this is the question that you're also raising, that I usually sort of ask, including myself, when I engage in some more, if you like, complex work. Where do I think my main contribution is at? And I always knew, for my sake, it's never social practice theory or pragmatism, right? To me, you know, I sort of bring that into a different conversation, which then is the question of what conversation do I actually bring it in? And where are the potential jarring points to that conversation, as in, you know, it's all been informed by structural equations and economic rationale and reasoning, then I know this is where I have my points of contention that I can then motivate and leverage that new perspective I'm bringing.
Great. I think, Pavo, did you have your hand raised? We might take one more question before the session ends, if that's okay. I'm not picking up your audio. Can anybody hear Pavo? No? Okay.
Okay, I just changed the mic.
There we go. Perfect.
Okay, so what in which way, in your opinion, the entrepreneurship or as practice approach, theory as practice approach, is better or complementary to Kurt Levin's or Levine's action research approach, and what are the benefits of the experiential learning approach? Do you see it as complementing, competing, one better than another? No,
Look, I would never look at one, you know, of one is better than the other. One might be more suited for, I don't know, questions of X or answers of Y. But where would action research fall in? I guess I'm not too familiar with action research. There could be experiential learning, I think I sort of feel more comfortable speaking to. So experiential learning and a lot of these origins, they share similarities in actually coming back to, you know, that long forgotten focus and grounding in practice. And I guess action research partially would too. So when we talk about practice or the practice approach, I would look at, you know, there's the different terms. There's a practice term, there's social practice theory, and then there are specific areas, applied areas of research, like EAP, strategy, or entrepreneurship and strategic management. And to foster novel insights, one might adopt action research in, say, entrepreneurship research. Now that might still fall within, you know, the EAP domain, the entrepreneurship domain. I mean, the question there I would have is, you know, does it matter if it falls within or does it fall outside of it, right? The question to me simply would be, you know, does action research allow me or help me to answer questions or grapple with questions that I'm actually having? And so, you know, a very similar line of reasoning I would follow with regards to experiential learning. the question there is, actual research, and even within actual research, I think there is very different like ontological underpinnings. The question there is, what are these underpinnings, and what are their ontological assumptions, at least, are they in line with, or are they in contrast with that other body of literature that I'm trying to engage with? I think that is,
I'm a professor of management in the School of Business at Cambridge University.
that is a challenge.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, from the people in person. There's a lot to think about. I took a lot of notes, many things to digest and come back to. So I just want to say thank you. I have questions that can't be answered right now, or comments, but at some point in the future, I hope we can discuss things. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Paul.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you,
everybody.
Neil. Thank you, Ola, organizers, Thomas, and others. Thank you. Have a good conference.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So everybody, we are going to take a 30-minute break. We'll be back at 11:30, and we'll have our panel that will start then. So yeah, we'll see you at 11:30. You'll see us mingling in the room, but we'll still be around. You can hear it.
Neil, how are you doing? Everyone good in the room? Hi Neil, how are you doing? Everyone good in the room? Hi, Neil, how are you doing? Everyone good in the room?
We're just taking our seats. 1 second.
It's tricky.
Last minute copies.
Yeah, it's just messaging Jean-Paul or Jean Pascal there as well. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I was just saying, Jean Pascal was saying he's going to have a little coffee, grab a quick coffee as well. So,
All right.
oh, and Raghu, I see you're online as well.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm still waking up, so have your coffee.
Very
Good
good.
morning,
Okay, so
Zachary.
you're getting your coffee as well. We've people joining us from everywhere, Raghu. So the time zones are all a bit funny. But I discovered what the problem was. Our clocks changed.
Yes, that's right. It's all about time.
It is all about time. So because I was really trying to figure out because I remember checking it and thinking I had it right, and then it's only afterwards I discovered, okay, it was
No
the clock.
worries.
Yeah. So for those of you who are online and listening to us here, Raghu is joining us, and it's 5:30 where he is at the moment. So we're very lucky that we have your time you here today. So thanks very much.
If ever I feel angry, you'll see this. Oh, you can't even see my background, so.
Fantastic. Okay, and how are we doing, Jean Pascal? Did you get your coffee?
Still getting it looks, maybe.
Still getting it. Okay. Well, perhaps there's a little bit of a context or background to this session. I might just say a little bit about how we came up with this as a topic or a theme. And Neil and Dimo and I are working on a paper on performativity, and it's kind of come up, and then we're quite curious about how it connects to entrepreneurship as practice. And as the more we read about it, the more its origins seem to overlap, but it's a topic that we've never actually spoken about as part of the Entrepreneurship as Practice conference formally before. So then when we were designing the program and the schedule, we were just thinking, God, it'd be fantastic if we could incorporate a session on performativity. So that's how today's session has come about. And then we were trying to think of who'd be super speakers that we could incorporate into that discussion. So that's how we've ended up with Raghu and Jean Pascal. So I'm on a smaller screen at the moment, so my view is limited, but have we got, oh, we have Jean Pascal, you're there. So thank you so much.
Sorry.
Oh, fantastic. You have your
for the
coffee
delay.
as well.
Yeah, that's fine. I know it's Raghu who needs coffee rather than I, but I have a very young kid, so my nights are very short, so I need lots of coffee these days.
Well, congratulations on that as well. So yes, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you both here for this hopefully lively and enlightening discussion on performativity. Just to formally introduce you both, Raghu Garud is Professor of Management and Organization and the Farrell Chair in Innovation and Entrepreneurship at Pennsylvania State University. Raghu's research currently explores the emergence of novelty, and specifically he is interested in understanding how new ideas emerge, are valued and become commercialized. His current work on narratives as the generative force for the emergence of novelty within a system of meaning that shapes and is shaped by entrepreneurial foresight. So you're very welcome today, Raghu. Thank you for joining us. And for Jean-Pascal Gond is a professor of corporate social responsibility at Bayes Business School. So we might recognize it as formerly as CAS, City of London. His research mobilizes organization theory and economic sociology to investigate corporate social responsibility. So if anyone has researched performativity in organizational research recently or at all, you'll see that all roads do lead indeed to Jean-Pascal's work. So we're very glad to have you both here today. I was wondering if you could start, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your work, and what drew you to performativity originally? So perhaps we'll start with you, Raghu.
First, I want to thank you, Orla, for inviting me and the audience for bearing the torture for the next 1 hour, or at least half an hour of my time, I guess. You asked, who am I guess, what's my background and what research I do. I was thinking about this. I'm a person suspended in webs of disbelief is the term I came up with. I'm building up on Clifford Greets, I guess. And the reason I say that is because it has got to do with performativity. And I think it has got to do with critical performativity in a sense that going that route has opened up my eyes, that we are quote unquote artificial creatures, which we can challenge who we are. So that's why webs of disbelief and suspended in that. I started off as an engineer as background, and everything had to fit. Everything was right and wrong. A chemical engineer by background in that sense. And it's been almost 40 years discovering humans, the human part of technology and how they relate. I'm going to talk a little bit later on, but my interests lie in creativity, novelty, innovation, entrepreneurship. These are fundamental facets of humans, for good or bad. And they imply the past, in a sense, which has been carried in the notion of path dependence, which we have countered with path creation. They also involve the future, clearly. Now, whether the future is the imagination is whether it is individual or is it collective or is it in the fabric of the society, and it clearly involves the present as well and the three forces. So that's why performativity comes into play. So thank you for asking me this question. I shall pass it on to Jean-Pascal.
Thank you.
Thank you so much also for having me, and I'm very glad to be introduced to your community of people interested in entrepreneurship as practice. Actually, I'm a bit remote from the field of entrepreneurship, but I found really I know quite well the strategy as practice field, where I have lots of colleagues and friends who've contributed to that area of scholarship, and I'm glad to see that it has created those kind of spillover in different domains, because I sincerely think that strategy as practice, and even so it has been criticized from a theoretical viewpoint, and I've been one of the first to criticize it a little bit also. I think it has opened up a lot of conversation to social sciences and to very interesting authors who could have never been cited in IMG and IMR without this strategy as practice, who could feed with more European kind of theories, also a lot of conversation and so on. So I'm glad that this is happening also in entrepreneurship. As for my background and my interest in performativity, actually is really closely related to my background. I've been trained in, I've started studying economics, the more hardcore version. I graduated from an École Normale Supérieure in France of Cachan, where we were taught by expert in economics and management, and in particular in decision theory and decision analysis. And then after, during my PhD, I restarted the whole undergrad and postgrad in sociology while completing my PhD in management. And this is where I've been exposed to actor network theory in particular. The supervisor of my sociology dissertation was Franck Cauchois, who has contributed quite a lot to the discussion of calculability and calculability. And at the University of Toulouse, I could see Michel Calon coming to present his works and so on. And I found that very exciting. And what I found exciting at the time about the performativity of economics thesis is that I was very discontent. And I always had a problem with economic theory because when I've started my undergrad program, I was performing very badly because I was assuming that what they were, saying is some kind of truth. I was always trying to understand what's behind the model, to find an empirical illustration for what they were describing with the little curves and everything, the isoquant and the Edgeworth box and so on. And then my score were very low. And then at some stage, I realized I shouldn't care. I should just learn the things for the thing, and then my mark have increased, and I should say, oh, that's a distant abstract world disconnected from the rest of the thing. And then I became a good student, and I could graduate and so on, and integrate the École Normale Supérieure. And then this perspective in economic sociology and performativity for me was really useful to reconcile these two things. I realized, okay, actually they're doing that things they're doing matters because some people use it actually to build real market in some specific context. There is the whole problem of turning and transforming this very abstract knowledge into social reality. So in a sense, I think for me, it has made quite a lot of sense because it could reconciliate a lot of tensions and frustrations as a student also that I had when I was studying. And then also we were taught by our professor, my former partner, Lorca Bantus, and we had mainly professor in decision theory and decision analysis and who are explaining us how to construct preferences, how to elicit them, how to really do decision theory in practice. And we become very curious when I worked in organizational analysis that all the Carnegie School is about, explaining that rationality doesn't work, that, political dynamics are explaining everything. And so that you can get rid of this idea of rational choice theory, for instance. And we were taught by those people who are thinking very hard that they need to change the world to make it compatible with the axiom of rational choice theory. And that's the reason why our first paper with Lorica Bantus were really about this problem, because when we told people in sociology and organizational study conference that some people are actually trying to build those rational decisions, they didn't believe it. They say, no, these people, they do not exist, and so on. Say, yeah, no, they exist. They have been trained in Stanford. They are constructing this consultancy. It's very, very pricey consultancy. It took them sometimes 3 months to find the optimal decision. And we even don't know if the decision is implemented actually, but we know that someone has paid like a few $1,000s in order to build somewhere a rational decision. And this is like a market and a business on its own. So that's how our curiosity really has been teased out and why we started studying rational decision making and using the performativity lens to analyze that. So actually it was very coherent with what we've learned before, and it was helping making much more sense. And then after we've opened up this Pandora's box of performativity in social sciences, and we've discovered all this marvelous theorizing, like the fact that almost every scholar in social sciences has written a short piece on performativity. So I think also it was really interesting for us that so many people are using the same concept of vocabulary, but sometimes to do very different things in very different spaces. So that was what has kept us, I guess, interested in those conversations. I'm sorry, I've been a bit long, but that's the genesis. That's the genesis of these writings.
Yeah, it's lovely to hear the background, and going back to when you were studying economics as well, that the kernel was there from back then. I guess it'd be good to clarify what we do mean then by performativity, given the fact that you said from your research you've seen it explained and defined in different ways. So we'll stay with you, Jean-Pascal. How do you describe performativity, if you could, in a nutshell?
Yeah, in a nutshell, it's difficult. I would say that there are lots of different ways of thinking about it. I think it's basically about the constitution of the world. And I think the problem in this process of the constitution of the world through artifact theory or representation of the world, one of the aspects I'm the most interested in is the role of scholars and academics in this kind of construction of the world. So for me, performativity is really about arranging the world and constituting the world in some way. So here it could be equated with a form of social constructionism or social constructive perspective on reality. But I think it really, I think really the value is the reflexivity it creates for you, the fact that you cannot think of yourself as independent from what you're studying. So everything has to be in the world when you're studying it in the making. I know it's very broad, it's a very liminal definition, but I think to me that's what is at the heart of performativity, and that you can find in pieces in a lot of very different definitions. I think they speak to that underlying process of constituting the world.
Thank you. What about yourself, Raghu? How do you conceptualize performativity? What is it to you?
Well, John Pascal hit the nut on the head. You can't say it in a nutshell. That's what he said. And the interesting thing about performativity is that true to its origins, I guess, there are multiple interpretations depending upon who is using it for what purpose. You can approach it from Austin's seeing is doing, which is clearly an interesting point of view. Or you can come at it from science technology studies from Pickering, for instance, the performativity in the mangle of practice, which might also be close to what you folks are doing at the moment. Or you can come from Michel Calon's and point of view of economics and economic sociology of markets and how they're made. Or you can come at it from the other philosophers like Judith Butler or Karen Barad, for instance. And I think what John Pascal was alluding to is that these are, I use the term artificial, but these are constituted worlds. These worlds are constituted through the sayings and doings of the people around. And he brought in many more issues involved with that, that it decenters agency. He happened to talk about arrangements. And my French is not as good as John Pascal's, but I shall try to imitate a little bit. But John Swan, maybe he can help me out. But the agency and the arrangements, I think, thank you. Well, the agency and the arrangements, I think this is really decentered and it's distributed. It takes a very different view. I think later on you'll see for entrepreneurship, it takes a different view of what entrepreneurship might mean. In my discussions with Michel Calon, for instance, we would talk a little bit about time and temporality as well. And that issue came up in our discussion and debate between Calon and Butler in Journal of Cultural Economy. I think it's a really nice debate, actually, which people might want to read. And they go into illocutionary and perlocutionary performativity. Now I'm getting into the weeds, but the issue actually out there is that he happened to make a statement in that if you extend the length of time you see, that don't see it as of today, but extend it, then what happens is even illocutionary performativity becomes perlocutionary. Means things unravel, things are in the making. So what we think about as a settled state is not, it's always in the making. Now, this is a really profound shift for me, at least, because it takes us into practice and process, and not for efficient causation, not to end states, in which we fixate on an end state and try to describe or explain why that end state came about, because phenomena is always in the making. And I think we are living in that world nowadays. We are not living in a very stable, static state of affairs. And it's for that reason, I believe performativity in its core elements might be quite useful, actually, in theorizing what's going on.
I think that's really interesting. So can you tell us maybe a little bit more, Raghu, about how you use that perspective in your own research then? So what do you do differently by adopting a performative stance in your research?
So I will talk about a few things. Of course, it is into everything I do, actually, whether I use the term performativity or not. I realized that John Pascal said something very interesting. He said a lot of very interesting things, actually, which woke me up. He says, it's about what scholars do, for instance. And you have a lot of people who are scholars sitting in the audience who are either trying to get a PhD or got one and trying to get promotion or get published. So we are all operating within context, or I don't want to use the term context, but we are operating within performative context, let's call it that way. And the third reviewer, by the way, the third reviewer is the worst. All three reviewers, but they are the people who determine what's going to come in or not. And if you're writing for one journal, it's one thing. And if you're writing for a different journal, it's a different thing. So John Pascal, for instance, happened to mention AMJ and AMR. I think it's changed quite a lot, since the last 10 years, 15 years. And so there are possibilities, the Cabantus and Gond paper in Ox Science, for instance. I recommend everyone should read that. So things are changing in the American system, but nevertheless, I think it is still slow to change. And so I'm very cautious as to the use of the term performativity, because if I'm trying to publish in those journals, because then suddenly the people will say, what is this? Just a fancy word. So I may not use the word, but I might, I'm clearly driven by how I think about it. And how do I think about it? Number one is that I don't think of agency in individuals. These individuals are constituted by the structures in which, the arrangements in which they are operating. So you have to view it that way. I look at sayings and doings as performatives, and the fact that when you say and do something, how do you change the worlds around you, or how do you try to do that? As a part of this is, what are the instruments or artifacts which Hendrik is going to talk about tomorrow, I believe, or in one of your panels, which come from a design point of view. How do those artifacts in you? I go from what we would call as dualisms to dualities, meaning, you are actually working with business models which you are part of, and the business models are changing and you yourself are changing as well. So in that sense, it is processual, in the sense that it's always in the making, and you're experiencing not only just relationality, that is between yourself and the artifacts, but also temporality. You experience time in a very different way. I know that I'm not making too much sense, because like I said, it's early in the morning for me, but it makes my life all the more difficult for me to write. You'll find it very difficult to find an article of mine which takes an individualistic ontology at this point in time. So it is, I'll just mention two more things and then keep quiet about it. So it is not any more epistemology or ontology. It is onto epistemology. What I mean by that is, going back to John Pascal's point, the instruments that we as researchers use are constituted of the worlds that we discover. I'm happy to clarify later on if you want any of those. This is a point I'm not making, but Latour has made, active network theories have made it all the way through. So if I use a certain kind of instrument to probe reality, I'll probably find some kind of, I'll constitute the reality around that. if I use net present value is very different from Black-Scholes, model, for instance. But I'll add one more thing which I've been rather interested in. It's not just the ontology and epistemology, but the axiology, the values. And I think that we are performative in that sense as well. Our instruments that we use to probe reality, to understand reality, I'm using the term reality in quotation marks, are such that it is infused with values. When we say that we are going to measure performance by the profitability of firms or shareholder profits, for instance, then are we missing out on many other things that we ought to have, which we can't measure in the normal sense? So the values are implicated in the very research that we do. So I conclude by saying it is onto epistemic axiology. All three of them are involved in a performative stance to research.
Great. I think that's really, it's really good and interesting to incorporate the last of those there as well. Jean-Pascal, I think it might be nice if we could see how some of this materializes in your work. And one reading in particular that I thought was quite interesting is your organizational research methods paper, The Performativity of Literature Reviewing. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit maybe about the background of that paper, but also how would you describe the performativity of literature reviewing? It's a task we all do almost daily, probably, and everyone has experience. So what's literature reviewing from a performative perspective?
Yes, thank you for asking me to talk about this. Actually, that's interesting because that reflects quite well on the situation described by Raghu at the moment. Just like as you start thinking in terms of performativity, performing, then the way you're seeing your own work and your own research practice and even very mundane practice you tend to consider as taken for granted, they take a different flavor, a different meaning. And actually I've been involved in quite a lot of exercise of literature reviewing in different subfields, in corporate social responsibility, in performativity. When we completed the first this literature review in EGMR, where we're trying to clarify the different definitions of performativity, we were asked by the reviewers to take a performative stance on our own review, which we thought makes perfect sense. And then we explained that we're aiming at actually trying to constitute the field of organizational scholarship by bringing together and linking a lot of these conversations that are taking place in different space. And then there has been a lot of discussion and panel about literature review, and suddenly I think people have started realizing that there is a problem in the way we are reviewing literature. And I think at the Academy of Management, they've organized panel asking editors of Academy of Management Annals, EGMR and other places to reflect on what is a review, what is the purpose of a review. And what is super interesting is when you listen to them, they all say that what is interesting in the review is not the review. They're not interested in the description of the field, which is what a literature review is supposed to be. And then there is something more, and they say, no, we're just looking at the research agenda, but still they want the description of the field, which is interesting because who's the user of a literature review after all? It's a PhD student starting on the field, and she or he wants to learn about the basic things. So it's someone who's a kind of a Bayesian lay person in relation to the field and want to discover it from the outside, but it's reviewed only by experts who are not interested in this account of what the field is. So there is something really paradoxical and bizarre in literature reviewing, is that the more thing goes, the more the editors are asking you a new contribution to present the field differently. And then you have to discuss with experts of the field who are basically not interested in any kind of representation of the field. So that trigger my mind, and also some discussion with reviewers and editors in other experience of literature reviewing, telling us, now you review only the top tier journals. The other, you cite them if they have space. And I think in the field of micro CSR, this was really frustrating because you had like 20 papers in top tier journals and 250 in lower ranked journals. And when we discussed with the editor, he said, no, literature reviewing is just about describing what is in the top tier journal. So we realized this exercise of trying to construct a representation of the field is actually biased in so many ways, and including in the very systematic literature review process. So when we saw the call for paper with the colleagues, we saw that could be a really interesting opportunity to try to make a point about our systematic literature review as systematic, and to what extent do literature review actually try to constitute fields of scholarship rather than represent those fields of scholarship. And so we're looking at this movement of reviewing as representing and reviewing as intervening, using very basic sociology of science insights. And then we've used the Fabian Muniesa typology of the key problems and tensions related to performativity, what he called the problem of description, which is by producing your own research, you're going to add something to the world. So you're not going to, it's impossible to describe the world because you're changing it by describing it, basically. And that's what a literature review does, because they are typically the most cited paper of the field, but they are pretending they're not in the field when they describe the field. There is also what Muniesa called, Fabian called the problem of explicitness. Like you use categories, and by presenting a literature around categories, you give the impression those categories were there before, even so they were not there. And that's, you know, this tendency you have to force paper in a category to make it fit your nice framework. And then you create a problem. So for instance, all those papers about institution, you will call them, let's say, macro, and the one about organization, meso, and the one about individual, micro. However, you know, in the field of CSR, for instance, lots of reviews have done that and putting Habermas into macro. But I mean, if you read closely Habermas, it doesn't make sense at all to say that Jürgen Habermas is a macro theorist. He's interested in how people interact conversationally. So it's a misclassification. But then in so doing, you construct a problem, which is the separation between this cluster. And then the research agenda is about, oh, we need to develop the relationship between micro, meso, and macro that you have worked very hard to construct in your own review. So that's this problem of explicitness we're looking at. Then there is this problem of provocation. By reorganizing the literature in a specific way, it's like doing a micro experiment in the eyes of your readers. They will see the juxtaposition of paper, and that will create new ideas for them. So you're creating knowledge from within by rearranging and reassembling things. And finally, you do a literature review usually because you're unhappy about the field, because you want to change something, or because you want to nudge that field in a specific direction. So there is always a very purposive, intentional aspect, which could be seen, and we don't say it's subjective, but it's maybe political, maybe subjective, or it's not as objective as what people working on evidence-based management or systematic literature reviewing are saying, because there are so many choices that have been done when you do that. And when you discuss with people having crafted successful literature reviews, usually they are very clear about what was their intent, and sometimes they're very frustrated. We've discussed with people who have crafted some of this CSR literature review, and some of them, they're furious because they've become one of the most cited paper, but not in the field they were targeting. You know, they wanted to change like the discussion on CSR by bringing in political CSR, and they got 500 citations in political science. And they say, but we knew people in political science knew about that already. We wanted to explain people in CSR that they should do it, you know. So that's interesting because you have all these attempts and a lot of misfire also in that process. And so we're providing this representation of academic field as much more co-constituted by the exercise of review. And we think reviews have an interesting status as an entity or non-human that contribute to shape a field. And again, based on experience, recently we're trying to do a review, extending this analysis to do a more systematic review of all the literature review on the field of CSR and sustainability that is becoming so big that nobody understands what it is about anymore and whether there are boundaries. And if you use Web of Science or another engine or EBSCO, or you end up with very, very different set of reviews, and the level of overlap is very small. But if you want to comply with the current standard of good systematic review, you need to say you've used only one of this engine very systematically so that you are perceived as very scientific. But in so doing, you completely bias the representation of the account of the field you're producing. So that's where I think if you start looking at a lot of our practice, And what I say here for literature reviewing, I've not explored for other aspects, but I think it's probably true for interviewing. It's probably true for a lot of data collection practice we have. I mean, we are very, very shaped by technology, by non-human entities. And I remember the good old time when we had to travel to the library in Paris of INSEAD, because this was the only place where we could read the first issue of Academy of Management Journal and Review before EBSCO and all this data set. I mean, the way of doing practice, I mean, being a good PhD student at the time was about how to fix a copier and how to copy as many papers as possible in a library which is far away, and then read that. Now, with a few clicks, you got all the literature in front of you. So I think if you think about that and how it changed the way we're doing research, I think it had a massive impact that has been completely understudied. And that is coherent with decentering the message of Professor Garud, is really decentering from human and start looking that EBSCO is doing a lot of your work actually nowadays, or ProQuest or any of these data sets. And we should pay much more attention to that.
Yeah, I think as you were speaking, it was really great to hear an activity such as literature reviewing. And I think I probably speak for many people in the room that, you know, we could really relate to the problems or the issues as both the writer and the consumer of literature reviews as well, and their impact on the field. Related to that, you have another article that I was interested in. I'll come to you in a moment, Raghu. But Jean-Pascal, your paper about the boundaries of performativity as well, boundary conditions of performativity. So that's an AMR 2018 paper, When Do Theories Become Self-Fulfilling? Is there a similar vein through that about the use of theory that you've just outlined with literature reviewing? Would you like to tell us more about it?
Oh, actually, the genesis of this paper was different because I've started it in 2003. It was part of my PhD, which was on corporate social responsibility and financial performance. And that was an overstudied subject and topic at the time already. So I was trying to find another angle to look into it. And I thought, well, that's interesting that nobody in that field is considering that the fact that people consider that there is a business case for CSR, or a relationship between CSR and financial performance, may be known by practitioners who are actually contributing to implement CSR. So especially I was studying financial market, and it was very obvious when you discuss with them that none of them would do that if they didn't think there was a business case and a relationship with financial performance. And they were producing lots of great research and white paper trying to show that because it was essential to the constitution of their business. For social rating agencies, for ESG, they were not called like that, they were called SRI people at the time. It was essential to have that. And for academics, it was essential to try to, in business and society, at least for a long period, people were already thinking if we show that there is a relationship with profit and financial performance, will become as important as scholars from strategy and finance and so on. So we legitimize our field. So I thought very bizarre that nobody thought about that relationship as kind of socially constituted and playing a role for the actors whose behavior is supposed to explain that relationship. So actually it was an empirical, the empirical phenomenon of this relationship that was of interest to me. And I've used the performativity angle to try to theorize it, first with Guido Palazzo at the time, who left the paper. And then a few years after, and at the time we were trying to mix it with institutional theory so that reviewers could understand what we were doing. It didn't fly very well. And then Emilio was a postdoc at the Cass Business School at the time, no base. And he told me, no, actually, I think you should get rid of institutional theory and let's try to make it a more performativity paper. And then we've discussed together, and it came with a fresh perspective. But the message of the paper was really to say, actually, reaching performativity is quite, the Barnesian type of performativity is quite an endeavor. And that takes a lot of effort. There are lots of conditions. So I think for me, the message of the paper is not surprising that you don't have that many cases of Barnesian performativity around, because there are so many like boundary conditions you need to fulfill in order to make that happen. That was our message. So, and it has been interpreted in very different ways, and then it has been shaped obviously quite a lot also in the review process, as Raghu has described before. You need to negotiate. And I remember this discussion with our editor saying, well, could you rephrase some of these sentences so that people who think that there is a reality external to the research world can still read your paper and understand it. And so we had to try to maintain this ambiguity so that it could make sense. If you're a positivist and reading in a positivist manner, it could make sense for you. But I think in so doing, we've maybe betrayed or we're not 100% fair to the kind of core axioms or principles of performativity. Hence the follow-up discussion, I guess, with Raghu and the colleagues reminding us of the need to present things in a more fluid manner. But this is what we were trying to do in that paper. And I think the critique was that the paper is too linear. I think we're representing the thinking of Mackenzie in a linear way, which I think is the logical way. And we send the paper to Mackenzie and they say, yeah, no, that's a fair representation of what I've written. And people were very upset by that part of the paper, it seems. I think the second part of the paper recognized that it takes time, that it could be recursive and so on, but of course, we had to box it, we had to add the arrows, we had to make it look like an engineer style of little mechanism, and that's not necessarily compatible with let's say, a strong commitment to assumptions about performativity.
I think there's two great lessons there for all of us. One being that it could take 15 years to develop a great paper, and the second that it is a market, and there, our buyers are the reviewers, and there can be a little bit of tailoring accordingly as well.
You have to compromise. You have to compromise sometimes. I think what is important is really to keep the essential. And I know that my colleagues at BASE, and I know we had this informal discussion also with Raghu before about how much do you compromise or not. I've never been in a system where I was tenured with the threat of getting published or perish or those kind of things. So I always had the freedom of doing the kind of stuff I was interested in. And I know it's a luck, and that nobody doesn't have this such a similar luck or situation. But then what is an acceptable compromise or not for you? Sometimes you may retract the paper because you think they're pushing you too far or destroying really the message of the paper. In the case of the ORM paper, I must admit that's the first time in my life where the three reviewers understood what we were aiming at doing. The editor understood too, and it was the smoother and nicer review process I ever had in my life, because everybody was telling us, instead of refraining, make sure positivists will like it, they were like, no, go with Muniesa, use it even more, push the argument. So they really asked us to do more of what we wanted to do. And I think the paper is maybe more interesting as a result. So that's delicate, but I wouldn't suggest to. I think sometimes reviewers, they may read quickly your paper, so you should also recognize their points. But a reviewer may read quickly an argument and don't get everything. So you may want to re-explain yourself and take the risk of re-explaining yourself and clarifying in a second round, to protect what you think is really the core of your argument. I think it's important.
That's great. And Raghu, you were making the point earlier as well that you don't necessarily specify the term performativity in your work, but it comes out and it influences all your studies. So your work on narratives, you're certainly are one of our leaders in the field in terms of research on narratives and in entrepreneurship research. So how does performativity interact with narrative in your work? And could you tell us a little bit about how you conduct your studies and indeed write them up or publish them as well?
So I got to go back a little bit to talk about why I started getting interested in narratives. It so happened that when I was in New York University, John C. Brown of Xerox PARC came by to give a talk. If you remember, John C. Brown is the Brown and Duguid and Cook and Brown. These are the people who did the practice, knowledge as not as possession, but knowing in practice, for instance. So when he came and gave a talk, his talk was on how stories and narratives carry knowledge. And I was sitting with my colleague, Caroline Bartel, and I said, how interesting that it is not in the constructs, but it's in the stories. And that took me back to how knowledge or knowing is transmitted through the ages, through the myths. And I was thinking about the myths in India, for instance, and how they are transmitted and how they are interpreted and reinterpreted and lived. So that started off the journey into narratives, meaning making, abduction, and a series of papers, initially with Caroline, then with Roger Dunbar, and then subsequently there was one more gentleman, his name is Jerome Bruner. Bruner's work is rather remarkable, actually, if you would like to read, and two modes of thought, which has got to do with, he compares logico-scientific with meaning making through narratives. And he says that there's lots been done on logico-scientific. Let me shift to narratives, to meaning making, because that's more about motivation as to why people do what they do. And that, if you read that, it really opens up your eyes that have we been caught and trapped in this logico-scientific approach, and then suddenly get surprised when elections are lost or something else happens or entrepreneurs don't make it, and on and on. So that's kind of an eye-opener. Because it takes us away from the intellectual apparatus, which has been conditioning how we think. But then the real shift to narratives and performativity happened when I started reading Paul Ricoeur on time and narratives. And Paul Ricoeur's work, what it does is, it takes us further into the notion of meaning making through narratives. And my read of that, of course, you can read it in multiple different ways. But what I found very interesting is that life is full of discordant, disruptive, or events which don't make sense. And so we try to give meaning to it. And we don't even think about it. Most of them seem as if they are normal because they have been normalized into our daily existence. But if we open up our eyes, there are multiple things which don't actually really fit in. And so it is to give them meaning that we start using narratives. But when you start thinking about narratives as a way of trying to give meaning to phenomena that we encounter, these are not just psychological, but they're also social and social material, I must add. What I mean by psychological is that for Paul Ricoeur, there is, he doesn't use the past, present, and future. For him, all three are constituted in the sayings and doings of things. He calls them as mimesis. He's trying to get away from the chronological notions of time and how the future can condition the past can condition the future, and how that activates attention in the present. He calls that as kind of anticipation, memory, and attention. What Joel Gehrman, my colleague, and myself, we call that as plasticity of time. So the plasticity of time is how do you gain temporal experience. So in that sense, it is psychological, but it's also social because you're drawing upon the currencies and symbols and stories and intertextuality, which is floating around in order for you to make meaning. So when I go from one cultural context to another, for instance, if I travel from America to India, I really have to recalibrate as to how I speak and what I do. In fact, recently I met some people from India and we were chatting a bit. And it was so interesting because what we think is completely unacceptable, they would sometimes use terms which I would cringe. And then we would point it out, and then they would say, we never thought about that. So one way of recalibrating is to go from one place to the other. Travel from US to Europe, for instance, or to India or China or some other place, and you start understanding. So by narratives, I just don't mean it's performative because saying is doing. I was also influenced and attracted to this in the meantime by some movement by Mike Lounsbury and Mary Ann Glynn, and their SMJ article on cultural entrepreneurship. And essentially what they're trying to do out there is that take it away from just individual entrepreneurs to think of entrepreneurs as operating in cultural contexts in which they have to tap into intellectual capital, as they call it, if I remember that article correctly. And in that, they use the term storytelling. And the storytelling is important because it is an act of persuasion when initially nothing exists. Now, you can come at it from a kind of a realist dualism, as if there is a there out there and you're trying to persuade. And if you don't, then you are pulling a fast one. Or you can come at it from a performative point of view, that you're actually trying to constitute the very worlds in which you're trying to persuade the people to join you in creating that. And what happened was I got into interactions with Liliana Dognova, who is also a performative theorist, École des Mines, who works with Fabian actually. It just so happens, without her knowing and my knowing, she wrote a paper for research policy. I was the reviewer. I really liked the paper actually on performativity of business models. Business models are performative in the following sense, that actually you're trying to persuade people to join you based on that performative model. And if it doesn't come together, then you have to change, you have to pivot, as it's called. So I've kind of taken you from narratives as just sayings, to carriers of knowledge, to knowing, over in context. Joel and I wrote something on contextualizing rather than operating in context. Entrepreneurs contextualize. It's a huge difference for us. Operating in context is as if there is a there out there, but when you contextualize, you actually trying to create the very environments within which you're trying to operate. And then I've taken you to time and temporality issues in narratives, to the actual doings of things through business models. This has been my transition of trying to take narratives into performativity.
Yeah. And how do you think that connects back to practices then? Because there seems to be such overlap between them. Would you consider yourself a practice researcher or a performativity researcher? Are they interchangeable, or do you see them as distinctly different?
If the question is to me,
sorry, Paul, I'm with you, Raghu.
They are fundamentally connected. If you look at the work of Shatsky, for instance, or one version of performativity, which I failed to mention earlier, which had great influence in our field, is through Litor, coming through Martha Feldman and Brian Pentland, or performativity of routines, and Diadro, her work also as well in terms of innovation. If you look at the performativity of routines, it is essentially about practice. And so my background is in science and technology studies. So I come at it from, for instance, Pickering. And if you look at Pickering's work, it's all about the Mangalore practice, which then takes us, if you want to go in that direction, it would take you into social materiality, and which is basically Wanda Olikovsky and other people who are in the IS discipline. The interesting part is that there's a lot of work in performativity, which has happened because of Wanda and other people, including actually, I saw that there's a session tomorrow or today, I did not fully check out, on structuration. So if you start looking at Steve Barley's work, it's on structuration and coming from Giddens' work. So I think performativity is central with respect to practice theory. In terms of, I think you also got Henrik Berglund talking about artifacts and design. And as I understand, he is actually launching a new journal called Journal of Business Venturing Design. So here's a plug for everybody to submit something to JBVD, apparently. So he's going to launch it soon. All these things to speak to practice. What is difficult to get it published in, but not as much now, but about many years ago, but now it's getting easier, somewhat easier, is when you actually bring in practice, you bring in, you contextualize rather than decontextualize. If you look at the number crunching, logico-scientific, you tend to decontextualize things, and you're trying to find out things. Invariably, I'll get from reviewers, how generalizable are your arguments? And it really goes against the notion of performativity, in my opinion, because it's not about generalizability, it's about translatability in the kind of active network theory sense. How do you translate from one situation to the other? That's the difficulty you have to navigate, what John Pascal was also talking about. How do you navigate the reviewers? But anyway, I hope I have answered your questions to some extent about how, to me, practice is performativity.
Okay. No, you've absolutely more than answered the question. A nice plug there for the new journal, which Henrik will be speaking about next or tomorrow as well. And what about you then, Jean-Paul, or Jean-Pascal, sorry. Last question, and then we'll open it up to the room then. How do you see the overlap and connection between practice and performativity? Anything else?
Yeah, no, I'm sorry I had to step out because I was frozen and about to lose all of you. So I came to plug the Ethernet cable so that we can keep going the flow of interaction. So sorry if you have disappeared for a few seconds. And I missed part of the point of Raghu. I mean, so I hope I won't repeat something which is obvious. I think, in a sense, I think it's very, I mean, there are lots of overlap. I think it's very difficult to study performativity if you're not interested in studying how people do create, or people or human or non-human, and different entities are assemble each other, do things. I think one of the concepts, I mean, this paper with Lorica Bantus, which was like our first paper really on performativity published in Science that Raghu was mentioning before, we're trying to develop a concept to bring together strategy as practice insights and performativity. And we developed this notion of performative praxis that has been reused, I've seen by some sociologists talking about performative practice. I think every kind of practice is performative in some way. I think we are using it to say that different kinds of practice contribute to bring into being specific words that correspond or fit with specific kind of theoretical framework. So I think, to me, the two things are really intertwined, because methodologically speaking, as soon as you start conducting a field or study on performativity, you need to follow the actor, to follow the entities, to try to understand what they do. And that's very compatible with the kind of practice perspective. But I think this notion of performative practice or praxis, I think could be expanded, could be developed. And I was surprised to see, I think it was in a book in economic sociology or on the social studies of finance or markets, where they say they were really building up on that to say, this is how we need to study performativity. So, I mean, I think there are some insights or intuition here. And I think in the context, and I don't know here, the only thing I know about entrepreneurship and performativity and practice is Raghu's paper in the special issue we co-edited in long range planning that I would recommend you to read. But it seems to me that entrepreneurship is a super nice way in order to analyze those kind of performative praxis or performative practice. So how these different actions are producing those effects that could contribute to bring into being a new entity, a new organization. I think it's maybe more clearer and more neat than in some other empirical settings or contexts. So I think it's, I mean, you're well located to uncover and analyze this close intertwined interaction between practice and performativity in your field, I think.
Super, that's encouraging. It'd be bad if you said they weren't aligned at all. We'd be in trouble then. Can I just check, does anybody have any questions before we wrap up? Does anyone like to ask anything? Okay, if I can't see anything coming through, but Raghu, if we could, I might go back to you for the last word on this in terms of future directions in this area, and if you've got any ideas or thoughts on where research could go in the future in terms of performativity, practice, and incorporating your experience with novelty and narratives as well.
It's the same question which you asked John Pascal. Can you define performativity in a nutshell? And then it's the same kind of thing, you know, in a minute, what can we do in the future? And my answer is you can do a lot with it. First and foremost, it's a way of thinking. It's a meta-theoretical perspective on the world around you. So I have a PhD seminar today. It's an OT PhD seminar. And our guest speaker, actually, by the way, zooming in, is Edward Freeman of the stakeholder theory. So he comes from Virginia Darden, where Rorty was. He is a performative theorist. If you know the background of this whole thing, and so in my PhD seminar, I have left them with this conundrum, and that conundrum I'm going to leave you rather than tell you what we should be doing, and that is the big elephant is that there is no elephant, and that's my so-called, not the last word, but my beginning gambit. So again, I will say that the big elephant is that there is no elephant. And this statement actually is coming from a performative point of view. If you want a clue for that, I would suggest reading Anna Mary Moll's The Body Multiple. And that might give a clue as to, and if anyone can answer that question to me as to what the big elephant is that there is no elephant, they shall be my friends for life.
That's an invitation for us to follow up there.
Yeah, absolutely. Please send me an email as to why the big elephant, that there's no elephant.
Perfect. Well, I think that's a great note to draw a conclusion on. So with that, thank you so much to Raghu and Jean-Pascal. We sincerely appreciate you giving your time and sharing your insights with us. I think it's been a fantastic session and clarified a lot of questions I had in my mind about how performativity relates to practice, and also understanding the motivation behind your work as well, considering you're such leaders in the field and have done a great job in presenting these ideas to us so far. So thank you again, and hopefully this is just the start of your connection and relationship with the Entrepreneurship as Practice community.
Thank you,
for
Orla.
having us.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
All from
Great.
here in person. Thank you.
Sorry, Neil.
I wanted to say thank you from behalf of everybody in person over here as well.
Yeah, we are missing
Thank you so much.
Amsterdam, by the way. So
Yeah, quite
go
a
on
lot.
your boat cruise, enjoy yourself. There are some cafe bars apparently.
We will.
Okay, see you folks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Bye.
So over to you, Neil.
Yeah, so on the agenda, we have about an hour and a half lunch break now, so people can have plenty of time to discuss everything that was just spoken about. I'll leave the Zoom room open. So please also, if you feel like you want to discuss what you just participated in or listened to, feel free to do so. I'll mute it for our room so you won't hear our discussion as well. But yeah, feel free to have this moment of discussion over lunch, and we'll be back at 2 o'clock. So we have an hour and a half for lunch. Yeah.
So hopefully everybody enjoyed it. Yeah, it's
great.
But other than that, I'd say we were very impressed and blown away by the volume of contributions that we had and the quality of work as well. And one of the sides of the EAP community has been, okay, we've had these conferences, but and people are presenting research at those conferences, and what happens to that research afterwards if you don't see them materializing in journals? And sometimes the journey to a journal can take quite a long time. And so the handbook has been a really nice platform to promote and celebrate those practice-based studies that are happening in entrepreneurship research, and also to celebrate those authors as well who've been involved in the entrepreneurship as practice community over the years, and to celebrate their work as well. So I think, yeah, it's just been an honor to work with them, with the book, and also with the contributors as well. So thanks to everybody who's involved, and it's nice to give it this platform now today as well.
Thanks, Roland. That's great. Okay. Now I guess we can move into Bill. Do you want to introduce the handbook more about the forward, perhaps?
Sure. Well, thanks. But the forward's fairly short, so it's only 5 pages. In one sense, I feel like I should read it, but I'll just say that, we had a conversation yesterday about the nature of why practice, why now. And I would say the forward simply just introduces those same ideas about why practice, why now. And to say, you know, there's certainly been a history of the nature of behavior and what individuals do, but I think the genius of practice certainly is being able to celebrate actually this access of, if we're focusing on practices, we don't necessarily then have to spend time kind of like celebrating the individual in that way that we do. We can look at practices, look at individuals, and look at context and celebrate that whole process. So as I think, you know, the thing is, you haven't seen the handbook, so I can just say, you know, the issue of, you know, practice research then can kind of manage this whole area of kind of what do we think about relationship to entrepreneurial process and where we go. The only other thing I'd say, then we probably just need to open up for questions again and maybe talk a little bit about what happened yesterday is, to me, one of the nice things about where the field is right now is it's really opened up. You know, we're not caught in a quantitative orientation towards treating the phenomenon by having to generate numbers to measure what's going on. You know, we can use qualitative methodologies to explore the nature of what the phenomenon is. And I think that's appreciated in ways that even 10 years ago made it difficult to publish qualitative papers in the way that we can do that now. But also we can celebrate different kinds of methods for going about understanding how practices occur. So, you know, to me, that's, I think the joy of it is that, you know, kind of the Mao thing, let 1,000 flowers bloom. We're really seeing these different 1,000 flowers in relationship to practice research. And the handbook, I think, represents it. I'm just really impressed with the number of authors and the quality of the authors and what they've been able to say and do. What more can I say? I wish the book was out and you all had a copy in your hand. One of the things I say in the forward is, you know, to me, this is now the baseline for where entrepreneurship as practice is going. So, you know, it will be a required reading for anyone who's going to be in the field.
Great, thanks,
That's
Phil.
it. 5
Yeah.
minutes.
It's a nice introduction, I think.
Good. So now we can move on to Karen.
We can.
Oh no, I'm not on till 2:30.
Okay.
Do we have any questions from audience members or anybody that wants to know more about the process? Oh, there's Tamim. About the process or what this might mean for your own research or things like that. I forgot to mention maybe before we move on or do anything else. Let me just share my screen again. I left off with the methodologies, but one of the things that's important is oftentimes is how to conceptualize what your empirical findings might look like with practice-based perspective, because in some sense we're doing a lot of new things and it doesn't track so clearly onto a lot of qualitative templates of, you know, if you look at a qualitative research, generally speaking, how they present findings isn't quite the same as the practice sensibility. So we have a very nice contributions by authors that have been involved in EAP. They very kindly submitted their empirical articles as well. And they're very fantastic exemplars for what your findings looks like, you know, like as a guide. I always find that really helpful if you have like a really clear perspective of what you could do, you know, what's possible. So as we had in this morning, the performativity of our own research, it brings new knowledge and it also inspires in the sense the new empirical advances are also trying to inspire us. For example, the final chapter by Dominique and Chris Baird is really great because it's really difficult to trace the connections between practices, especially as they transgress different geographical boundaries. And this study is really nice by being able to trace the practice and follow it from country to country, as I think it's the coffee industry, as coffee beans are as an artifact that moves from place to place, and all the practices that surround that and how value is created along that value chain. So for me particularly, that was a really in-depth and a really interesting way that you don't usually see in entrepreneurship studies of how the material object can be the anchor for. Paul mentioned this a bit about how in and the reinsurance, the artifact that cuts through or is carried through all the different practices of the insurance rewriters. In this chapter, they kind of follow the coffee bean as it's the value is created around it from all these different entrepreneurs and industries and things like that. So that chapter to me was really interesting. There's a lot of other chapters as well. Katya, if you don't know Katya, she's been doing practice-based research for a long time in business very generally, and recently has turned more towards entrepreneurship. And they had some questions in our PhD day about connections between practices. What's a bundle? What's the difference between a bundle and what's the difference between a practice? And for those kinds of questions and how you can visualize this, her chapter is particularly helpful for understanding how you can see the interconnected bundles. So the last thing I'll say, Baukje is here as well. Baukje's chapter about family business and the co-run working space. As maybe you don't, maybe you know or you don't, but Baukje is like an expert in the social production of space. And so bringing that into an entrepreneurship realm and understanding how practices are from the family as well as the business are entangled, I think is also very helpful to visualize how like family business might work in a practice-based perspective. And I might as well just mention the last one as well, because I've already done the rest of them. But Jared is a friend of mine, and he and two co-authors, Lars and Dennis, they did more of an ethnographic ethnomethodology. This is particularly interesting maybe for Alex because it's about the pitching, but it happens after the pitching. So the judgments or the evaluation, how that's a social production with the analysis of the judges and how the judges kind of talk about what they've just done, the meaning making and the decision that they come up with on all of the different communication, micro communication practices, I guess you could say, that led to that. So also a very different way of conceptualizing practice and researching practice. So I just wanted to say those four empirical chapters are really great, different exemplars.
So Neil, I'll kind of come back then to a couple of other things. So I think for me, the critical thing, and kind of to reemphasize about kind of the presentation yesterday, is that so with the handbook and then also with the two special issues and a number of other pieces that have been generated, the secret to success in academics is community and having an ability to identify who the readers and writers are in the area. And what really has been, I believe, the genius of the EAP conferences is that it really, over these number of years, has been able to build a community of scholars. I mean, when EAP 1 started, there were very few people in the room and very few people who could really, I think, have a consistent conversation about the nature of what practice was. And what has happened over these years now is that with the special issues, with a number of other introductory chapters, and now with this handbook, we have an identifiable group of individuals that are embedded in entrepreneurship as practice. That now we have a way to have a conversation and build on that. And that's always the challenge with the research area is, and sorry to digress a bit, you know, one of my concerns about European scholarships for a long time is that oftentimes European scholars had brilliant ideas, but there wasn't necessarily a community to have a conversation with. And so it seemed to be everyone was kind of doing their own thing in their own literature. And the genius of Americans actually is that even though we're an individualistic society, the statistics are Americans have more organizations per capita than any other country in the world. So Americans fundamentally like to organize and join. Okay. So we're not individualistic in the way you think. We're actually joiners in a lot of different ways, and we actually know how to create communities in some ways. So what I've liked about the EAP effort is that coming out of Europe, it really has created a community, a way to join, a way to think about how to do research in this area. And that's the crucial way to get published. You're now in an identifiable group of people that now you're in conversation with. So as you're writing, you, I think, have to be very, very aware that this is the context in which things happen. You're not writing into the esosphere of all kinds of stuff. You're writing actually to this community. And if you write to that, it'll make it much easier for you to get your ideas out in the world. So, you know, Yeah, as I say in the foreword, it's a momentous occasion. It's, I think, really a turning point in where the field's going. So I'm just really happy to see this research handbook out. But, you know, it's taken a long time to see this community really kind of come into emergence. And, you know, Karen and Neil, I celebrate you for your efforts at the beginning to really make this happen. It's really paid off, but it's, as you know, taken a lot of persistence over these years in order to make that work. And I know, Orla, you're there too. Orla, you were really there a lot in the beginning as well. So, yay.
All right, yay. Thanks, Bill.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a nice introduction to the handbook. I don't, want to give too many spoilers, but we're going to have. Oh, Sarah, did you want to?
Sarah's hand up, yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to say, I don't know if you saw it on the chat, so it's completely unrelated. Tamim is in the reception desk, and she doesn't know how to get to the room she's supposed to be in. So I don't know if someone could help her. I can't because I'm in Canada, sorry.
Yeah. And it's like 5 in the morning for you and you've been up all night. So that's it.
Neil, do we have a minute? I'm sorry, well, we have Anna online. Anna, I don't mean to land you into it while I'm landing you into it, but I was wondering, do you mind if we were talking about yesterday's part of the PhD as well, and one of the things came up was practice and the influence and how practice research can influence practitioners in the field and that kind of loop back and implications of findings. And Anna, we had your dear colleague Paul with us this morning sharing his experiences, and we had a great session with him, and he touched on your project that you had funded, that research project, and he had one slide up and some information on it, and it looked like it was the evolution or the startup process essentially, and looking at the startup processes and practices of entrepreneurs. And I was wondering, would you mind, because I think this is a super example of how practice research can get funding and has implications and can contribute back to the field. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about this project and the process of applying for the funding and feedback from those reviewers, and a little bit about.
Yeah, sure, happy to. I'm guessing Paul and I have two big projects on sort of entrepreneurship as practice. I'm guessing the one that we got, I mean, obviously as sort of funding kind of goes, we initially applied for the first project, but it took us 3 goes until we got the funding. So it morphed into what we're now studying. And we've spent nearly 2 years following one startup sort of through COVID. And they pivoted right at the start of COVID to really look at how they went from a small team of 3 to growing to now having 30 employees over the last 18 months, and shifting from being self-funded to recently closing a $4 million sort of angel Series A / round. And with that project, when we sort of applied for it in Australia, we've got one main funding body, and the big sort of needing to come up with a project that's more than sort of a paper that can have really strong implications for sort of practice in the sense of practitioners, the government's funding it, and also sort of making sure it's got a really strong theoretical side to it as well. So that was kind of the big grant that we applied for. And I joined forces with Paul, obviously because he has the strategies practice perspective, the routines angle. And I was really keen, and I'm sure it's sort of what most of us gets drawn to entrepreneurship as practice, is really not having a strong understanding of what's going on the ground. What is it that entrepreneurs do day to day? So that's where we kind of joined forces, where I had this really strong sort of interest in understanding the phenomenon better, and Paul had the method and research skills to bring to the table to actually be able to study entrepreneurship as practice. So I think for us, it was kind of joining forces around this topic and kind of leveraging each other's interests and expertise. And so we were really lucky it took us 3 tries to get the funding, but it was sort of really trying to work out how do we leverage our expertise to kind of ask a research question that we hadn't really seen answered yet in the field, and created at a scale where we could turn it into a sort of a 5-year project. And so that's what we've been working on. We've been collaborating, I think for now, six years. It's taking us a long time, obviously building up data sets with these kind of large projects, but it's been a fantastic sort of, I think, journey to go on collecting these large data sets and trying to work out how do we actually capture practices. Our first attempt was very much interview-based studies, which is obviously not getting at the practice enough. And so then it was shifting to how do we find a case study where we're actually able to observe what's going on every day. And that's where finding a startup that was going through a scaling up process, but also had a lot of manual operations happening, a lot of employees, enabled us to kind of do a lot more of the observation that's required to really capture practices. So we were able to be part of stand-up meetings every day, being able to be out in the field and capturing what was going on the ground. So we could really shift from an interview-based study to an observational-based study.
That's great. Yeah, thanks for sharing it with us, because I think it's a great example of how practice research can get funding, and then if you build up that team of expertise around it as well. And it's also interesting to hear it took a number of attempts. It wasn't the first submission that was funded, so we've got to persevere with it.
Yeah, what's entrepreneurship, it's challenging to get funding in Australia for these sort of projects. And so Paul and I were lucky, ours was the only project that was funded across all of business, across all different disciplines in business the year we got funded. So it was awesome that it was an entrepreneurship project that was picked, because often it's something in supply chain management or something that's got more of an economic bent to it. And last year, another colleague at UQ, also not doing practice, but more doing qual methods, also got the only major grant that was funded across all of business in entrepreneurship. So it was really exciting to see qualitative research more generally getting funded, and also the sort of entrepreneurship research being elevated above sort of the other disciplines, to see us getting 2 large grants in the last couple of years.
Yeah, and I think it's great. I mean, we've used from the Entrepreneurship-as-Practice conference. I remember the first one, we had a big kind of whiteboard, put out whiteboard, and we're saying, well, what would be the objectives for this group? And one of them was, you know, we'd have another conference, and then we'd form we get a website, that we would have a special issue. We'd hopefully have some kind of a handbook. And I think as the years went by, we've definitely ticked off each of those. But in terms of an outstanding gap, perhaps in research in the EAP community, is funding and funded research projects. So maybe that's something that as a group we could kind of think about in the future, and another aspect to the EAP community as well. So if anybody wanted to continue this conversation offline or in addition to the conference, maybe we could get in touch and see if there's some kind of a joint application we could put in. And I know these things take an awful lot of time, but it might be worthwhile having a conversation and seeing how you and Paul have managed it is great. It kind of gives confidence that this is an area and it's possible as well. Good area of research. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, I need to switch a little bit roles here and get some slides loaded, and then we'll move on to Erin's presentation. And then me. Is that okay?
It's okay.
Yeah, okay.
Good to see everyone.
See everyone.
I'm so sorry I couldn't be there for this one. You know, I think I'd mentioned, some family issues kind of kept me off and on from being in Europe. So looking forward to being there in person next year, and looking for the continuation of the conference. I think this is just really important for us to be there. I pushed all these ideas already yesterday about the nature of who you know is basically who you cite. So, developing this community is really important. I hope you're spending a lot of time together, getting to know what your research is about and where you're going. And again, one of the things I like about research in entrepreneurship is entrepreneurs in general know that our job is to create win-wins and to grow the pie and make it bigger. I think that's basically your joy as well, is that, everyone can win here. Everyone can be a wonderful scholar and have their day in the sun. So I look forward to reading all of your stuff as we kind of go through where this goes. And I'm looking forward to seeing where you publish. So with that, I'm off.
Thanks, Bill.
Have a great afternoon, and I'll try to, and then I'll also, I know I've got papers to discuss on Thursday, and I haven't been able to access where they are. So if there's a way to get a hold of those papers, I'd like to find them.
Yeah, I'll send it to you today.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Bill.
Bill. Okay, just a bit of a warning. I do have a cold. I tested negatively, but I hope my voice will hold. Anyway, it was a round table, so I'm just going to relax and sit down, and hopefully that helps as well. Okay, Neil has my one, or actually
Still
two
getting
slides.
there.
Should I send it to that email address?
No, it's okay. I forwarded it. So let me just forward it to the when I'm signed in, it'll be easier.
Are we still online?
Yeah.
I think so. So it's hybrid, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I send it to you personally, so.
Yeah, but I'm not. It's hard for me to access that one. From,
Okay, then I'll just send it to this one.
I have it.
Ah, yes. Okay, well, there we have it, and thank you so much, Neil, for bringing this to the screen. For those of you who had already had a bit of a sneak preview, it's a gloomy castle, but it's not going to be a gloomy talk at all. With the introduction of the research handbook, there has already been reference to actually the origins of our EAP movement. And I was actually going to do something similar because, well, unfortunately for those who cannot join us here, but for those in the room, we actually literally at some point had lunch downstairs, just outside here in one of our campus cafes. And we had lunch that included Neil and Bill, of course, and myself and a former colleague of us. And we really just literally sat during the lunch at the table, having found out, of course, that we shared an interest in, kind of doing more of the non-mainstream entrepreneurship research kind of thing. That's what we were discussing. And then we actually, well, each and every one of us had already been diving into social practice theories in terms of how this could help us de-mainstreamize, is that a word? Or otherwise it's now entrepreneurship research. So we literally sat at lunch and we said, we're just going to start and create a movement. I don't have to spend too many words on that because Bill already explained what it means in terms of creating a community. It is just, you know, we put the word to it, and then we brought people to join us in our movement. Yeah, and given that our first conference here at VU was in 2016, I think it must have been late 2014 or early 2015 that we agreed upon this. And yeah, you know what happened afterwards. And of course, we also incorporated quite some existing work. We actually really literally did that. Oh, this is a wonderful article, and it fits very well with our movement. So we kind of took a lot of work that was already there as well. And then we went on. So from the first EAP here at VU in Amsterdam to Orla in Dublin. And then we went to what we used to call Växjö in the south of Sweden, but we learned over there that it's actually Växjö, right, Karen? But anyway, it doesn't matter. We had an interesting conference. The first day was in this, you may or may not recognize this as the Linnaeus University Teleborg Castle. But there was this interesting incident. And for some of you, this may be a bit of a repetition because this led to a workshop at the third EAP, but we were sitting jointly as EAP community scholars, etc., in just this very, standard type of lecture room facing down, so in one direction. And then somebody also mentioned it were 3 white older men sitting in front of the room, and we considered that as a group, as an audience, and also as the 3 white men, we considered that problematic. And then on the spot, we also tried to do something about it. I think it was Thomas Siren who ran down. And it didn't work. And we all realized it didn't work. And in as much as we wanted to kind of enact entrepreneurship research in a different manner, we realized then and there that we should also be able to alter our own practices. And that idea, that notion, that kind of stuck with me, and also with Malin Tilmar, who hosted the EAP 3 in Vecra. And so then she and I continued with a workshop at EAP 4 in Nantes, also trying to further explore what can practice theories do to help us, to inspire us, to alter our own practices, given that is what we wanted to do initially with the EAP movement. So yeah, turning to this, the question was indeed, do we have an emerging mainstreamed EAP going on? And that for me also not only had to do with the stuck happenings there and then in Vecra, but also, well, we were with some of us discussing, are we making enough use of the practice theories critical powers, something that Sylvia Girardi is also alluding to a lot. And with some of us, we also thought that perhaps we are still talking and thinking too much still in terms of, we want to know what entrepreneurs actually do, rather than really de-individualizing the phenomenon and really turning to practices and their connections, indeed, Neil, as you were alluding to. So around that time, I met my co-author, Camilla Anderson, who is from a totally different field. And she had literally been using new materialist theorizing, so that's really close to the post-human practice theorizing, to unravel stuck happenings in her case, quite specifically to do with racial considerations and practices. And I was really, really intrigued by that work. We also met up as a group. Orla and Neil was there, and a couple more. I think Amba as well. No. We met up with Camilla here, and I continued to work with her on this book chapter, because we both thought it was a wonderful opportunity, and it has just turned out to be one big experiment. So she has really been so helpful and great in putting her experience, reading and thinking to work with me together jointly, to see if and how we could, well, de-mainstream EAP research insofar as we still thought it was possible at the time. So yes, it was indeed about the question, can all this new materialist thinking help us to go even further beyond dominant and taken for granted ways of thinking and doing, and now in particular, not just entrepreneurship research in general, but EAP research in particular. So she brought us to Latour's work, and what I found so striking and interesting about that was that call to proceed slowly and cautiously and with care, because we tend to kind of think, okay, we have a situation and we want to change it, we want to do something about it, and and as Latour describes it, that is then more of a linear progression, if you will, and he describes that as more of a fleeing from the past, then working with the practices of the past that are still there are still connections, and bringing them to a new future, a new situation. And the other thing that Camilla and I talked about a lot was affirmation and affect. So really turning towards, well, the hopeful rather than what you don't want. So what would you want, and how can you rearrange situations? I found particularly powerful also there the notion of the post-human subject. So not the individual entrepreneur or the individual me as a researcher, but the manifold that each and every one are as assemblages with all the influences and all the historical traces and everything that's going on at any one particular point in time. So yeah, that brought us on the path of thinking in terms of the very many complex and systemic workings going on, of course, also with entrepreneurship practices and with our EAP research. And then we thought, we came on the path, owing also, again, always to Bill, with his, he has wrote an manifesto in 2016, which is also very much meant to kind of shake up entrepreneurship researchers and say we can do things plurally and differently, and like he's always forever suggesting. And with that notion of manifestos as a response to dominant cultural values, of course, there has been a great hype also in relation to the cinema, the world of cinema. And there is, of course, even more cultural values, but then you can also see this in terms of our EAP community cultural values, and see what we just an experiment. What could a manifesto for EAP research do for the community, and can it help alter our own academic practices? Well, that very much in terms of trying to create an effect. So can this like be a call to attention, a wake-up thing, rather than effect in the sense that we are now going to measure whether or not it works. If you want to see what we actually produced in our experiment, you could put on the next slide, Neil. And so this is our proposed manifesto for the EAP community, the EAP academic research practice. And yeah, I just need to add one more thing, I guess, that yeah, whether it's not something that you can really initiate. It is kind of trying to alter small things so that those systemic workings can continue to do that. There are being pictures taken here. Great. But yeah, what we noticed, of course, was that with COVID, and when Neil and I were back in 2020, frantically preparing the EAP conference and realizing that it just couldn't happen, and all our work was for nothing, and we discovered that we could meet online. And I really personally, as an assemblage, think that that has in a way already kind of helped alter our EAP practices in a positive, affirmative way. Yeah, I'll stop there. Questions?
Can I ask questions about some of the meaning that you want to communicate in your manifesto? Track the shifting grounds. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, track the shifting grounds. That has everything to do with that idea that you are not like doing big instrumental things and steps and interventions and stuff like that, but you do try to unravel those complexer connections, and see if you can rearrange some of those. So those are shifting grounds. So it was not just, you know, it wasn't a big implosion actually at the time when we had to go online in 2020. But yeah, we did make, I think, good use of the grounds that did shift around that time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think we made them productive for sure.
Yeah, and so that is really, that would be my call for us as the EAP research community. It's of course always a balance between finding and creating rigor, but let us please continue to experiment, to resist becoming dogmatic. We shouldn't be just, we shouldn't be about this is still EAP, or this is still practice theory, and this isn't. No, go to the neighbors and experiment some more and have some fun, and then go back and get some rigor to the work. Yeah. Yes.
Thanks, Karen. I remember this event at Linnaeus University very much. And I remember also that, I don't know if Chris is part of this, but Chris Sayat was having a keynote, and he reflected upon, the founding fathers that we often cite. And so part of this was also that we were lacking the founding mothers. And I remember that we were counting that we were 7 female professors in the audience, and there were then all the men on stage. So this was kind of the theme. So what I'm wondering is that, have you thought about, how practice theory relates to feminist theories at large in this chapter, or more broadly? Could you kind of elaborate a bit on how you think about that today?
As
or
you
are
know,
they just out of this?
They are definitely not out of this, but as you know, I'm not so much a feminist reader and writer. But yeah, you rightfully say this, and I have been repeating this, acknowledging that it came from Chris from time to time. And it really are actually more of the founding mothers that you turn to when it comes to those effective considerations and the more affirmative type of doing critical practice research. And then, yeah, for me, it's mostly Rosie Blaidotti's work, but also, of course, our very own Sylvia Gerardi. And each and every one of them, of course, always forever emphasize that you cannot look at complex connections between practices without acknowledging gendered considerations, but also our Eurocentric thinking tendencies. So those are just very much in their theorizing, but it's not necessarily what I would personally pick up first when I start to consider this. Yes.
But can you, both of you or anyone in the audience, see that kind of emerging within the entrepreneurship-as-practice field?
You mean more of a consideration of gender?
Yeah, I was thinking about just, we have Donna Haraway, we have Karen Barad, we have Judith Butler talking about performativity. We try to do this now in the session for Thursday, where we draw on Fricker, Miranda Fricker, and then Butler. So I think there are lots of inspiration, but I don't consider myself as a practice researcher. So I would be interested in where do you draw the lines?
Well, in this very case, I don't think you should draw lines, because this type of thinking and theorizing is very much also about gender. And I know of this very particular group working on post-human theory and especially drawing on Haraway's work. Some of the people are in the room here, so but this is also not something that does anybody know that? I cannot actually give a conclusive answer here. Are we doing more of the gendered critical thinking?
I don't know if it's been like something we've been trying to specifically focus on. It's always been that EAP is a family of practice theories, and what that includes is very broad. And there's different aspects of practice theories that are calling themselves practice theories, like Shatsky says, I'm a practice theorist. But then we also include like ethnomethodologists, and ethnomethodology is not really a theory of practice. It's more of a sensibility about how to analyze really micro, everyday practical activity. And that's included. But by that logic, it just means that there's like a lot of different ways of thinking what practice theory is. And it can be a very fuzzy boundary. You know what I mean? We don't really need a fixed boundary of what is and what isn't practice theories. But when we read things like Karen Barad's book, we're in a reading group and we're reading Karen Barad, for example. She uses the word practice a lot as a really, not as like in a way that she defines it as a concept, but uses it as a really important term for understanding the combination of matter and meaning, and that's a really interesting way of thinking about things that has implications for us without it clearly being a practice theory, But I think that's totally legitimate part of our community. I don't think that's something we should.
I think as well, can I come in here for a sec? I think that that's a great idea for next year's conference, though. We could definitely have a session, a panel discussion, or guest speakers on gender and gender and performativity, gender and practice. And I think that we're probably due that as actually as a topic of discussion. So if anybody would like to be involved in next year's conference, or if anyone has any ideas or suggestions or contacts, get in touch with us, and that would be a super session to have. So whoever, I can't see who's in the room, but whoever raised the question, I think that hopefully you'd come to that then next year, and we could develop that thinking. So thanks for the suggestion.
I think if I may jump in, the entire chapter that Karen presented, right? It's about doing things differently. And what I take out of it is also to study critically the entrepreneurship practices that have become so dominant in some of the contexts, let's put it like that, or assemblages that are commonly associated with entrepreneurship. So we're talking about the accelerators, the incubators. And then the question is, where do these come from? And we often find they come from very male-dominated tech startups, VC environments from the US, with people in Y incubators starting these practices. So I think it's a very nice question to ask whether the adopted entrepreneurship practices that we have are in some way masculine practices, and whether there is a need to rethink or maybe show and portray how entrepreneurship can also be done differently. I think, especially if the goal is to come toward a relationality between people, then feminine or feminist theories are a very good path to reach this theoretical conclusion, so to speak, right? So what is the relationality between people? Not looking for ends, not trying to sort of get your idea through by all means and by power plays, but what is happening there, right? Where's the feminine side in entrepreneurship? How can we see it? And I think there's definitely room to explore this question. I don't know if the group has done it yet, though. So I guess we are open to it, right?
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Thomas.
Thank you.
I can comment later.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on actually something on your question. So, but also kind of thinking now about the different contributions. I think it's also very important to distinguish, at least for myself, it's extremely helpful to distinguish between research on gender or on gendered dimensions and then feminist theory, because those are not the same. And I think what strikes me as an important thing to keep in mind, and I was also reminded of it when I went back to one of the papers that Jean-Pascal Gon published on, and he discussed this morning on performativity, where they discuss sort of different, he and his co-authors discuss different approaches on different ways of understanding performativity. And the same happens with practice theories. Then certain things are clustered as being about this or about that. So Barad's theory is clustered as, and this is not by any means a criticism to that, because I really like that paper, but it's to present a review, again, which is a kind of a genre that he also talked about. It's important to cluster things and to put like a nice table to present the overview of the literature. And then a practice theory like Barad's is presented as being about gender, or these different practice theories are presented as being, or these different performativity theories are presented as being about something. But I think if you dig a little bit deeper, then I think, at least for me, I try to think of practice theories as ways of seeing the world being continuously constructed. And so if you do that, that also means that you take any kind of social phenomenon, whether it is gender or entrepreneurship, as being continuously constructed. So for me, there is a very obvious fit between feminist theory and practice theory as approach to entrepreneurship. That's yeah, the main points, I suppose.
Okay, then what you said, Thomas, resonated very much with some of my experiences with collaborating with Camilla in writing the chapter, because she very much, well, she's living and breathing the slow and cautious, and you make the division between male and female, but so I kind of, well, posited it then also as the difference between affect with an A and affect with an E, and the affect with an E being where you put in the power and the force and wanting to change, and this affective kind of way of going about altering practices and altering habitual ways of thinking and of doing things, where I really did realize that if you take the affirmative effective thinking seriously, it is really like putting on another set of glasses. It's like transitioning into like another way of looking, another way of experiencing things. And that is also, and I kind of think I forgot to mention that is actually to do with the presence of the gloomy castle on the picture, because and that was just, you know, it was a momental impression that I really did feel like it was a Cinderella castle with the glass shoe and you know, the need to. I kind of sensed that entrapment that we were enacting as an EAP community, and that was my sense of affect that I wanted to work with. And now I have been working with this for a couple of years, and I will not bother you again in this respect, but it has been the workshop, it has been now the book chapter, and now I'll just continue with, yeah, trying out this other approach. Yes. Any other questions or comments?
Do we have time?
Then we have 5 minutes, and then.
But Karen, can't you elaborate a bit on how we could then put this into work in the classroom?
Yes, that is another project close to my heart. Yes, how can we bring this more into our classrooms? Well, I think a couple of considerations are relevant when it comes to that. I do think that within the entrepreneurship research field, so not only EAP, but e-research more largely, we have come to the realization that entrepreneurship is obviously more than startups, creating enterprises, straight roads to success, and what have you. There is this awareness that, of course, there is so much more going on. That entrepreneurship is more about value creation, but there is also kind of a continuum between exploitation and doing even more harm to our societies and our planet. And on the other hand, also a realization that entrepreneurship might be able to do a lot more in a positive sense towards reviving and helping alleviate some of these big challenges that we have. So those are, I think, very important considerations in combination with the need to forever become more inclusive, also with education at large, but also with higher education in particular. And you can see a lot of the elitist way of educating going on when it comes to entrepreneurship education. And then last but not least, there are these really, really fun, interesting, cool pedagogies being enacted all over the world that actually work with inclusivity. You have the radical pedagogies, the transformative pedagogies, the critical pedagogies, the eco-pedagogies. Please do dive into those, because they are doing the real fun stuff and bringing actually the post-human and practice notions also to our education, suggesting interventionist approaches, seeing the whole educational assemblage also as complex systemic arrangement where you can really alter things if you treat carefully and cautiously once again. So don't do the big things, but experiment and try out the smaller things. Yeah, so for me personally, that is definitely one of my my roads ahead, as you may notice. Yes, any more other questions?
Yeah, I did have a question, but that would initiate a whole new conversation. And I thought that this would be until 3:30, but it's not.
Okay, then we leave it to the next question round, perhaps.
Yeah. Having a conversation with the customer.
Okay, because it's now 14, and I think the next one will be online, or how does it work?
No, it's right next to you.
Oh, wow.
Just here.
We can shift chairs. And...
So do you want to send it to me?
I did, but I think I sent it to your normal email, as in university email.
University? Okay.
No, it's just on the USB.
Oh, there it is. Sorry, I don't see an attachment.
I think if it's okay, if you can plug this in.
Well, actually, the screen is the computer, so.
Right, because the connection, I don't know, I tried to connect with my mobile, should have come through, but
we can try it.
Yeah, it's come through.
Let me check. It's the other one. The small one. Do you want to plug it in?
Hope so. I don't know if the screen is shared with the.
I can do it real quick. There's two of them, so I'll share it real quick.
That's you.
Let me share it first.
There's 3 pictures, I think, so it's not like people are missing a lot. It's not my pictures even, I just stole them from the book. As we do. I just went out from a long conversation about copyright.
I invited a couple of entrepreneurs to a social entrepreneurship course last week, and one of them is really a radical, social entrepreneur, and he was like, we just steal the ideas. And I thought about, is this a practice that we haven't, we steal ideas.
We'll just steal it. Yeah, it's fine.
Cheating or stealing? Stealing is.
Yeah, he was, for instance, having this kind of walk around tours in the inner city with people, homeless people, often addicted to drugs and so, and as a way to start working. So, and they are doing this in a lot of cities. So we just steal their ideas.
Well, thank you for
for inviting me, and thank you for the time you dedicate for this. I suppose I think I'm gonna try to keep it as short as I can. It's black on purpose. I'm very proud of myself. I'd like to look at me, but it's really what we claim in the chapter. Three things. So the idea is to present is to defend, I suppose the word is, or present the strong structuration theory, and then I think, as with other colleagues I heard this morning or this one arrived and over the phone, we worked sort of on a couple of topics. I'm a really big fan of strong structuration theory, and Lisa has got a data around a wine entrepreneurs that they work with. So we came together, and that was after the conference in Audencia. Oh, dear God, it's been now 4 years. And they were called for chapters, and we thought, oh, that would be interesting to see your data and the theory, and if it fits or not. That's going to be really interesting to see, because one of the issues that she didn't collect the data to do this, actually, and then it was an experiment for us, and here we go. The chapter was born. So I think I'll leave you to read the example, which is much more detailed by Lisa, and she knows her data better. And I think in the chapter we claim three things. So I'll just try to discuss these very broadly and very present them for you, and then take questions or move on to the next one. So the three things we argue that strong structuration theory can help is, first is something around the context of the actors and the agents. The other thing is around the process of structurations, comparing, for example, to Cadence, was provided very little details on the process of how this unfolding happens. And the third is the methodological guidance that we couldn't be inspired by this theory. So these are the three issues, and I've got 3 slides. So I broke the rule. I was told to prepare one only. The first thing is around the agent context. So I think when we discussed this with Lisa, what we found interesting is that obviously Stones should be seen as somebody who's looked at what happened before and as an evolution of structuration theory and other theories and critique of that theory to come up with strong structuration theory. I don't know how much some of you are familiar with this. I think some people online have noticed them as well. And we've done last strong structuration conference in Dublin, but I think it's at the IUT from memory. So basically he argued for the basic argument there is a very abstract level of knowledge and a very abstract level of knowledge, of theories, and very on-tech knowledge. What we do, we lift the phone and we drop it. And there's something conceptually in between the two. And this is where he argues we should pitch our collection of data or even our understanding of things. And in the same way, he looks at the agent themselves as positioned in a network of position practice. So position practice is really came from Pascal's ideas around we are in a role and we're expected to perform things, we're expected to do things, we're expected to adhere to things and be a rebel or not. And this expectation becomes our resources, but also our restraints. But as we expect these, others expect from us and we expect from others. And this becomes sort of reciprocal as we go along. And these create this web of position practice where everybody is situated in a middle ground where what I want, what I'm restricted with, and what other people want and expect from me, and what other agents expect from me. I say agents because there's a paper with Stones who also engage with materiality and how materiality affords or not things, certain things. So literally, I think the example we gave, I'm looking at my notes. So if an entrepreneur agent decides to introduce new planning practices for whatever reason, he's thinking about what she wants and what they want to implement, what they want to push. They think about their strange of the grounds and also the people working with. So we know in entrepreneurship, as far as I know, with my little knowledge, we work in teams. So we rely on each other's knowledge and we rely on each other's. So this gives us a little bit, we thought, anyway, we argue that gives us a little bit middle ground between the macro historical forces and a little bit relation that's more immediate to the agents. And this is at the midst of it. So that's our first claim to help with the theory is to help deconstruct the context. In the chapter, we give 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elements. So we give 5 elements, and we give examples of these elements as far as we can tell. So that should also help to think. The second part is the process of structuration. So with Stones, he argued that the process is really kind of time restrained 1, 2, 3, 4. So they present it as a process, which is interesting for me anyway. And here we see the really external structure. These are the forces we talked about, historical and social forces and societal forces that's beyond us. The internal structure, he really takes the part of habitus from Bourdieu. And he says these are our own restraints, our own biases, our own view of the words. So they call them general disposition. And then there's our knowledge of the situation. So although I know I have an accent, but how do I mobilize this in the context that I am with you? Am I bothered by it? Am I trying to hide it? Am I trying to restrain it? So this is sort of knowledge in the context. As a manager, I know I have power. How am I deploying this in the context where I am with others? And then obviously there's the actions or the intention to act or not to act. So these are the active agencies. So it could be restraining from taking actions or doing something about it. And then obviously the outcome of these practices, whether it's to change. So arguably they either change or reinforce the external and internal structure. So as we do things in the world, we either confirm to ourselves what we know, or we defer things, or we defer to others and we say, no, we shouldn't be this way. So here we see a process where we start from the macro, we go to the agent itself and her understanding of what's going on and her history and her understanding of the context they're in, and then taking the actions and then understanding the consequences of their actions. So we see a little bit of process. The third part I mentioned methodology, so context, process, and methodology. And our understanding of the theory and the presenting of the theory is that it invites us to do these four steps, so to speak. And we immediately projected it into an entrepreneur. So we start with the agent themselves, or the entrepreneur in this case. So here we look at the entrepreneur, the context, the network of agents, a network of practices or position practice they're in. And here we can think about, so there's an argument in the structuration theory for using agent analysis agent context analysis as the methodological bracketing. So we look at the agent themselves and what they're doing and how they're contextualized and what they afford or not. Nicolini talks about zoom in. I like also zoom in and zoom out, the Nicolini in terms of methodology. So here we really zoom in and hone in the first two steps on these actors, on these agents themselves or the entrepreneurs themselves. And to do this, we talked about methodologies. So I think there are different methodologies employed today in structuration interviews. Most of them are qualitative, luckily for some of us. So we talk about observation, interview, that sort of thing. I conducted a lot of interviews in opticians, and that's just fascinating how to see people moving around and doing things while they're doing it. And then we can abstract ourselves a little bit and zoom out, to go back to Nicolini and say, okay, so what's going on in the context and how the context is related to this. And that's also fascinating because when I did it myself, when I'm inside and the managers will take decision and they will justify their decisions or the entrepreneurship, but they will really tell a story about it, why they're doing it. But when you abstract yourself, collect data, really macro data about what's going on in the industry, what's going on in the company, depends on your level of analysis, then you can start to put your own interpretation on it. I'm a believer that we have a part of this as well. It's part of our research or part of our job as well to look at and try to understand from a different point of view, not only the research, but also from ours. And here we put things in context and we try to contextualize their actions. And what happens, for me anyway, is the fascinating link between micro and macro, because you go in, you go out, and then you try to establish, you position yourself and you somehow try to establish the two. Try to understand why they did this yesterday or today in the context they are doing. So you position yourself again in this meso level, and this is what I like. So I said 3 points, 3 slides, and that's about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Questions?
Maybe just clarification. So did you mean with, I didn't fully get what you meant with strong structuration theory. So it means that, does it mean that you take into account the sort of the history of structuration theory and its reception and the different branches, or?
Absolutely. I think I dug into immediately to the story. So Rob Stone is a sociologist. He used to be at the University of Surrey, and he went to West Australia. Now he's still there, I think. And Rob Stone developed strong structuration theory and simply taking Giddens, taking all the critique for Giddens, and then proposing a new version of it. So it's literally the work of Rob Stone's, and then it was taken in different way.
So it's very different from, it's not the same as Giddens.
No, it's not the same. I totally, yeah, I dived into the topic itself. Yeah. So there's I like his book because he takes the history of Giddens and the main ideas of Giddens, the critique of Giddens by different peoples, and then how he goes about and think about how to keep this idea of duality between structure and agent, because this is what's really interesting in structurations. And then he proposes new details of that based on the trying to overcome critiques, but obviously not overcoming them completely. And since 2005, it's been deployed in different fields, really. Seen papers on health management, entrepreneurship, finance, accounting, and others.
I have a question, or rather some comment that we might discuss. On the second slide, the picture you've showed us from the networks. No, I mean the first slide, I mean the second slide, yes, exactly. I think that's a very common way to represent a network, right? With the agents as the interstitials and the lines, the connecting lines, the networks or whatever. I think it was, I mean, at least that's where I have it from, but Jim Taylor and Elizabeth van Avery, who came up with the idea of a communicative constitution of an organization, have suggested to maybe flip around this picture. And because the risk is here that we end up in an individualistic and an agent-focused view at the end of the time, right? And we have discussed this morning that we perhaps want to go beyond that. So instead of thinking of the agents at the interstitials, why don't we take a look at the communication instances? That's what they argued. And I might bring to the table, why don't we look at the practices as the connections, and the people are sort of only the lines that are in between, right? It's also an open question that I haven't answered, right? Does this change of logic really make a substantial difference? Of course, I mean, if we think to what we've heard about Pascal today, from Pascal today, yes, everything, the way we portray things to be, that's also performative in a sense, but what difference would it make if it's not the agents who are the dots, but the practices? And how would we view things differently then?
Somebody else would like to, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking along not the same lines, but I was thinking with the concepts of externalization and internalization. You know, when structures move through you, and through that we also change our practices, of course. So it's like we're more permeable as agents. So it's not like we're autonomous, but structures, you know, go through us. So that's what I thought about, Thomas.
I think I totally agree before somebody else. So the part of habitus is really structures going through us from history, right? From our, you know, we talk about race, we talk about gender, we talk about certain things that we go. So I totally agree. And I think one of the shortfalls I found in this representation is that actually the general disposition, it's linear, it's just 2D, it just doesn't make it. But the discussion is really, yes, going through us for this part. And there's hint, but not really argument, but this is what I found in the empirical research, that when we talk about specific knowledge of external structure, we also talk about experience. So some, when the managers will say, but I know for a fact that, my manager would do this, would do that. So this is your knowledge. It's from the context, and exactly that's going through and going further. They transfer it to somebody else by talking about it, by performing it. So I totally agree. I don't know. I never thought about it as a practice itself instead of the agents. I think, yeah, I never thought about it this way, but I'm sure others have. I still think about, practices coming from the agents. So even, yeah, I never consider it otherwise. So I can't really comment. But
yeah,
it's a fair comment.
It's a type of practice theory, right?
Yeah.
It's the style. It's in the. It is different than Giddens structuration theory, like you said, but it's still in that kind of family, or it's a lineage of that way of thinking about practice theories.
Absolutely.
And maybe if I could ask you, what's, in your opinion, from working with this theory, what's some of the main benefits as opposed to
Giddens?
As opposed to Giddens, yes, but even broadly speaking, like a Schatzian or a I don't know how much experience you have with the other practice theories, but if you could think like what's particularly nice about strong structuration theory in a more of a dialogue sense with the rest of practice theory.
I think personally, I found it two things. I found enough details to go about and do things, which I didn't find in other theories, which remain very abstract. And second thing is that I met the man. I met Rob Stone, and I could ask him a question. I'm like, what does this mean? I would say, I don't know. But at least you meet somebody and you talk to them and you discuss with them. And that brings things to life, actually. And that was very helpful for me personally. And then I really, maybe in discussion, because this comes from when you write papers and then they say, it's not as clear as you think it is. But then this discussion became obsessed with this connection between macro and micro, really, and how you position yourself as a researcher between the two. And I've really become obsessed. I can't find any words. And this theory gave me the tool to move a little bit, scale it up, scale it down, and do this in a ontological way, and they can make a conclusion with it. So that's personally my preference. But
yeah, there is another obvious link, which is around the action. And I think it's in your explanation, but I know you said it's 2D, so it doesn't give justice to it, but as a representation. But the agency is really crucial in structuration theory. And agency has to do with practices. What are the people, the different actors, unable to do and or not? It's about action and inaction, but clearly about these practices around. And I agree with the visual criticism of the first model, which when you see it, people would think, okay, this is just actors mapping or agent mapping. It doesn't have that. The structure I know are there with your arrows, but the internalization of the different structures is not apparent immediately, which is something that structuration really brings strongly, at least the Giddens version of it. But clearly the link is there. It's really interesting. So, and the scale, what you call the scaling, so the constant dialogue between micro and macro, both in terms of what we observe, but also about the way we do it as a researcher in methodological terms. This is a good in that field. Thanks.
I think I should have a disclaimer as well. I come from a strategy as practice before, so I was obsessed with the actors and with strategists before. So still, I suppose, but so that's also a bias I think I'll bring along. Yeah, but I was a little bit over obsessed with disconnections, and I think we did some literature review to try to see if there are a lot of papers that connect both. And the conclusion we made, I've never published that paper, is that it's very hard to publish papers that connects macro and macro because you're not very well positioned going back to opening conversations. And I got the data somewhere on this, and it's not that easy. And we found few papers connecting these, and much more papers with macro, micro, and fewer papers in connecting the dots.
Can I ask another question?
I think there's also a question from Ina.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Ina.
Hi, Ina.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. Just a couple of comments first and then a question. In your presentation and also just in an answer, you indicated micro and macro as being in a hierarchy. here's my challenging question. Isn't that agency enacts micro and macro at the same time? They're not necessarily in a hierarchy, but interconnected, looking at, let's say, different levels of scale, possibly, of conceptualizing structures. And if we then, I did my PhD using Giddens. So if I use Giddens' language to say, well, practices are enacted drawing on and recreating authoritative resources, in as much as using allocative resources to make things happen. If we apply this to entrepreneurship, to sell a product or a service, or to do something online, create a website, wouldn't that therefore deconstruct this whole construct of micro, meso, macro as 3 levels of, very often in literature, not quite constructed as interdependent and not necessarily in a hierarchy?
Suppose you remind me of the paper written by, I can't remember if it's a paper or a chapter by, no, it was a paper by Zeidel and Whittington on strategy as practice and tone ontology and flat ontology. And I think they discuss it elegantly, saying that Giddens is ontological level, it's tone ontology. That means the established hierarchy between the levels. And that's your, yeah, that's a fair comment, but that's for me, that's the parting point. And yeah, and then there were other theories that's more flat, and they don't consider that hierarchy. And so I suppose there are different ways of looking at things, but your comment absolutely is right. It's a choice you would make. Suddenly 3 people want to talk. So that's a fair comment. I suppose it's really a choice for me anyway. It's a choice you make from the beginning on your ontological view and your position. But yeah, that it reminds me of this paper.
And of course, materiality can have agency as well, coming back to Thomas's question. And I think that's kind of where maybe the critique of Giddens is moving slowly to.
So that's interesting for those who's interested in materiality. We didn't include it in the chapter, but actually Stones developed somebody in the UK, what's her name? No, I can't remember. It's a paper where they try to approach both actor network theory and the agent of materials and softwares. It's in the healthcare industry, and the 2-3 frameworks that the 2-3 things I shared with you. So there's a paper which they try to present it together, and I believe the person concerned, and I can't remember her name for the love of me, she published 2 papers later on based on that on empirical data. So that might be of interest as well, but it's not mentioned in the chapter, I think.
Wanda Olakovsky, maybe?
No.
Okay, don't worry.
It's somebody in healthcare in the UK. I can see her. I can't remember her name, as one does.
So everyone.
Yes, I'll find the name. I'll find the name. I have the paper somewhere. Well, yeah, they take it a little bit much for the materiality as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yeah.
Can this process be applied to small businesses where the levels are merged sometimes? Or how this process?
The process of structuration itself? Yeah, I believe so. Lisa believes so. So yeah, basically, so she looked at entrepreneurs and how they could conceptualize and act based on this. I think she gives a good example, I believe. So yeah, if we look at it, I took it to another level with another colleague, Emma Vatassian, and we tried to take it to not individual level, but to companies level. So we said corporates could have agency based on certain conditions. And what are these conditions? So we discussed them, the decision making, etc., etc. And what does that mean? So we took it up a notch. Nobody took after that, so I don't think it's a flying idea, but I'll mention it as we speak. And then, yes, we can go back to the individual. So,
did you have a question?
Yeah, but this was for like the question to Karen, and so maybe to the entire group.
We might as well right before the break. We have 3 minutes.
Okay. In the manifesto, you stated that we need to resist dominant practices. And I was wondering also, like, a question to you all, what kind of dominant practices do we need to resist?
Good question. Who wants to go first? Yes.
Male, heteronormative, Euro-centered, quantitative, performance-oriented view of entrepreneurship, maybe. That's summarizing it.
Wow.
That's
you haven't thought about that at all. It's rolled out there.
But that's of course very, very important. But I think you refer to really our own community practices.
Yeah, I mean,
so what
you
should we...
you mentioned the example that you were standing in this lecture hall and you realized, no, we don't want to do it like this. We don't want to have like people sitting like this and then someone standing in front of the screen.
No, it was perhaps not so much that we didn't want to do it like that. It was a matter of, but look at us here. Okay, we started the EAP movement because we wanted to do things differently. We wanted to have a non-mainstream entrepreneurship research community doing things differently. And look at us, it was kind of reflective. We're sitting here and we're doing the same old we've always done. And then the next question was, do we want to continue doing that?
Mm-hmm.
So that was why one of the things that Marlon and I did when we tried to do our little intervention in Nantes back then was to walk around and to introduce materials and just, you know, how would that be? Don't alter practices and happenings for the altering of it. Yeah, I think you really should consider, and perhaps the most important thing is that we indeed intervene more in terms of the views than the actual practices, because how inspirational can we get sitting here in one room for a couple of days and sharing our ideas and experiences? Yeah, but perhaps somebody else wants to reflect also, perhaps based on your own experiences with doing things differently. I do think it is very important to really start doing such things differently in relation to entrepreneurship education. Yeah. So there I would definitely suggest get rid of the lecture halls, get rid of the notion of the hierarchy between the person in front of the room and the one sitting there who should only be listening to the person in front of the room. But that is another story, I think, for now.
So I just want to share that the notion of entrepreneurship or entrepreneurship education, while you mentioned, like, you know, the perceptions on like a positivist view of entrepreneurship, and I come from India and I've been in business school in India, and I've been part of the groups where if you don't measure like, you know, 10x, 100x, then it is not considered research. So the view of the world is so narrow, and it just doesn't sit in North American schools alone, and it's just getting implanted, translated into different forms and shapes. And I feel, you know, challenging those notions don't have to be restricted to only particular regions, because it's growing, and today anything is possible anywhere. And if we don't have enough voice or conviction to alternate forms of organizing, alternate forms of entrepreneurship, alternate ways of measuring it, communicating it, seeing it, feeling it, being it, I think all of that could be, you know, expressions of studying entrepreneurship, right? And also all of us being entrepreneurial in that pursuit. So I see this, at least there's an avenue to explore. So.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Are you happy?
I'm satisfied.
I'm satisfied.
Well, I'm very satisfied. I have a lot to think about. Definitely want to discuss how we can do things differently still. But yeah, thank you very much, everybody. We have a break now for half an hour, coffee break, and then we'll come back and have 2 more presentations by chapter authors. So yeah, we'll see you in half an hour. I'm going to leave the Zoom open just like normal. So feel free to discuss amongst yourselves if you'd like as well.
Will you introduce, Neil?
Yes. So next up, we have Steffen Farny is here with us, who's going to talk about his chapter on collective intentionality. A very important topic for us to think about the individualized aspect of entrepreneurship as practice and how we can think about that. So that'll go, well, we can add some extra time, and then Heinrich will present if that's okay afterwards. So do you have ability to share your screen, Steffen, if you want to or need to? Yeah. Okay, great.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Hi, everyone. Sorry I can't be in Amsterdam today, but it's great that you're having me today. And I'm happy to share a few ideas on our chapter on collective intentionality and entrepreneurship as practice that I wrote together with my great colleague Ewald Kibler from Aalto University in Finland. And before I jump to the content of the chapter, I thought it would be a good idea to give you a very brief background on where we come from so that you can get a sense of how these ideas emerge. So we are both very vested in studies on social and sustainable entrepreneurship. So we have more an interest oftentimes in understanding the mundane everyday practices that people conduct, embody, represent when trying to create social and sustainable value, instead of looking at studies, for instance, high growth enterprises and so on and so forth. And by doing a lot of field work, oftentimes ethnographic field work in sometimes extreme environments, we realized the importance of understanding these mundane aspects that we like to call enterprising, that people do oftentimes jointly, rather than looking at who the entrepreneur is and what their plan of action is, so to say. And we felt that entrepreneurship as practice directly speaks to a lot of our ideas that we have without having used the term before, because while a lot of entrepreneurship research is quite actor-centric, we were always interested in understanding these specific practices that people do. And one of the three key assumptions that I want to maybe discuss with you today, that we at least find that our key assumption of practice and ontology, is that people's actions are property of the practice. If you take the definition of what a practice is of Schatzky quite closely, so activities, embodiments of materially mediated arrays of human activity, centrally organized around shared practical understanding, then all the actions are not something of the individual, but something beyond the individual. So they are property of the practice. We felt that that is directly speaking to us. Then following in that line of thought, we always felt this is perhaps even more important in social and sustainable entrepreneurship, where you see a lot of joint type of action or even collective actions taking place, that there is something that is a shared element that constitutes something as a practice. And this sharedness or jointness, we feel we needed to unpack a little bit, and the entrepreneurship as practice, I think, is directly speaking to us in this aspect. And if you follow these two key ideas, then the constituting element of what we can then empirically study, so the shared collective practical understandings, they can be accessed through the activities we can observe and the material arrangements. And that meant we wanted to have a de-individualized account of trying to access the joint experiences that we were witnessing all the time. And in the chapter, what we then tried to do is we were building on the social ontology of Raimo Turmela that has lately also been picked up, for instance, in AMR by Russ McBride and Rob Wipka and others in the Utah circle who work on social ontology, and see, I hope that this becomes visible now, yeah, and try to understand how, for instance, the very nuanced and sometimes quite mathematical distinction between types of intentionality can help us reinterpret the types of practices that we were seeing. And what is quite neat, I find, in Tourmela's approach to trying to understand the collectivity aspect of practices is the distinction between shared intentionality and joint intentionality, and then a sub-form of joint intentionality being we intentionality. And what he and also colleagues of his argue is that we need to try to understand more deeply what is the group reasoning. So what is the functional group agent actually representing in the practice? And there can be different relationships that we have to each other in different circumstances. So just to give very brief examples that he uses and then to come to how we reinterpret our studies. So for instance, shared intentionality, you can think of the typical example being there's a tree fallen on the street and two cars approaching and you don't know each other, but in that very moment you need to remove, so you need to act together because you share private interest in the same situation. So you both want to continue driving and you have the shared interest of removing the tree, and because of that you will act together. But beyond that, there's no group reasoning. You might even forget who the other person is. So it follows the idea of I have the intention, you have the intention. So we both are privately committed to do something, and because of that, there's shared intentionality. And that is very different from what we find much more interesting, joint intentionality and we intentionality, that we were witnessing a lot in social and sustainable entrepreneurship studies that we were conducting. And with joint intentionality, there is then a group reasoning and a certain collectivity conditioning coming into play. So a typical example that he gives is that we all are teaching at the universities, and as, for instance, professors and research staff, we are teaching a joint seminar, but we are independently grading the assignments. So we have a certain commitment. There's a collective condition being present, but besides that, we are doing this completely independently, but obviously always in reference to the other person. Like, you couldn't consider that task just completely isolated. You know that you have done a shared outline, you have done this course together. So obviously, there is a joint intentionality in grading the assignment. You might even think in the practice how the other person is doing this. And a particular strong form of intentionality where emotions are very present, which is very important in my research, is we intentionality. And here, it's not just that there's a group reason being present, but it's basically only because of being a group member, you are performing something. So the example that Tourmela gives is that two people plan and paint a house together, and you wouldn't do this exercise alone, because it's only because of the existence of the group that you are conducting this practice. And this is the difference in we intentionality. And so for instance, when re-looking and reinterpreting our example, our own research, we found it really helps us to have an even more fine-grained understanding of the type of practices that we were observing. And there in the chapter, we give several examples of different studies that we have done, but I want to just reiterate one example to give a bit more flesh to the bone here. So an ethnographic study I did on post-disaster Haiti in a community in northern Haiti called Limonade. I was going there recurrently over time and witnessing a progression in how people connected to each other and had an investment in the practices. So immediately after the earthquake, there was what I would like to label in this case shared intentionality between the different actors present, because you needed to assess the situation, you needed to create an awareness and basically tell the people what's going on. So each organization, each person joining the initiative had the same shared intention, but besides that, there was no connector between the organizations. But as the recovery process developed, the social entrepreneurs that I was staying with and studying, they were becoming more and more role models, aligning their own practices with that of the mayor and of the reconstruction plan, and joint intentions between the different actors started emerging in the provision of disaster relief. So that before doing something, people were wondering how this would affect others. So this is a complete change in the intentionality of the people that then allowed different practices to emerge, such as, for instance, what was it in the second phase? I had noted it somewhere, but basically about developing trustful relationships in, I remember right now, building sanitary solutions instead of doing that at home. They were all thinking together how they could do that in a communal center. And later on, we witnessed a lot of synergizing and mobilizing engagement practices that were invisible at the beginning, even though a lot of people intended that to happen, because the different groups, they had developed some kind of we intentionality. So a women cooperative, for instance, they, instead of producing food by themselves, they coordinated with the social entrepreneurs who would do which kind of production. And this is, I would say, driven by the we intentionality that is completely conditional upon the collective commitment that the people have towards the group and how they feel that they're functioning as a group agent. So to not go over time, we hope that with this chapter, we were maybe starting a discussion around different forms of intentionality that explain the different kinds of practices that you might be witnessing in your own research, and the different kind of, especially joint or collective actions or practices that you're able to observe. And yes, I hope this were 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we can open up for questions. I think there's a lot there to unpack. It's really nice. I think it's really helpful to understand the different types of practices. It kind of reminds me of a typology of different types of practices where you have some practices that are very like, I don't know what the term was, but soft. It's like conversational types of practices that are much more improvised, that people know how to do without having such a high degree of conscious intentionality. And then you have more of the opposite of types of practices, those that involve a lot of coordination, more conscious discussion and talk about them. And yeah, they're more in the forefront of the actors' mindsets. And I think that combined with yours shows a lot of ways of, I don't know if it's a classifying thing, but it's a way of looking at the differences of practices and understanding how they can be different in the field. Helps you understand a little bit more about what you're seeing. This goes to the question we had in the PhD day of like, how do we identify practices? What's a practice? And I think this is a really helpful step in helping to understand the different forms that practices can have. And the intentionality is definitely a big part of that. Orla, if you have a question or a comment.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks for joining us, Steffen. I know you're very busy at the moment, so I'm delighted you were able to fit it in. I think this is really interesting as well, because intentionality is a very traditional individualistic phenomenon, and we've been having discussion over the last 2 days about de-individualizing entrepreneurship research as well. So I'm quite curious to see what kind of practices around intentionality, or how do you make that leap between the individual cognitive concept of intention to the joint, even the 3 different tiers you have there in terms of shared, joint, and we already is moving from individual to a shared or relational understanding of intentionality. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about other aspects of what are the other entanglements or practice elements that you would look for to try to explore shared or relational intentionality.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good remark. So when you look at the 3 circles, my idea there was really that in the center, shared intentionality focuses much more on the current dominating individual intentionality aspects. And I think this is how we access intentionality normally in entrepreneurship research, looking at people and what they individually are trying to do, and then how they're actually doing that. But we were witnessing in a lot of circumstances, for instance, another project, something that might relate to your own research as well. We were having an ecosystem research project in Helsinki in the nanocellulose sector, where big corporates, researchers, designers were trying to do something together. And it was really clear that because we were not seeing, at least in the initial workshops, any kind of joint and we intentionality, the argumentation, and almost as Neil said, was, I would say in retrospect, quite superficial, because there were no commitment to the group as such. So ideas were being exchanged, but you couldn't reach a certain depth because nobody was seeing themselves acting on behalf of the group to drive the entire sector forward. And only later on, in subsequent joint ideation workshops, people felt certainly belonging together, and that allowed for different kind of practices where you were, I don't know, becoming more vulnerable, where you were really sharing ideas, even intellectual property, and these kind of practices at the beginning we were not seeing. So I think there's a lot in empirical research that can be unpacked there. And if you then follow that up later on, this would then link it to the emotions research. It's also that obviously because of we intentionality or joint intentionality, commitment is much longer and much more stable. So you're already vested in a certain practice. And even if something is not happening, you might be returning because you feel this sense of belonging to the group and you feel like you're representing this. So the collective emotional aspect that comes in through joint and we intentionality is something that is also, I would say, highly interesting, because yeah, it explains maybe also why groups being dispersed and not seeing each other, but knowing each other very well, are then functional later on.
Yeah.
So
very good. Thank you.
Go ahead, Thomas.
Did you see that in the process, there was a need to first establish a common understanding among the participants? Or was that a necessity? And perhaps even to frame situations in a particular way? And I mean, how did they accomplish this? So were there a couple of practices that accomplished the different stages of intentionality?
yeah, it's great that you're asking this. I agree that Tourmela calls this the group reason. I think the group reason needs to basically change over time. So if you first meet with people in a certain situation, like you are there now, you have private interest, you all want to get better in EAP studies, advance the research field, but besides that, you might not have any attachment. Obviously in your group it's different, but in other conferences it would be that there is no joint intentionality being in place there yet. So the question is, what would be the framing task or the framing exercise that can be done for this group reasoning to, I would say, to change so that the people feel commitment. So we are thinking about joint framing in sustainability education at our faculty a lot, how this can be done better and how we can really then develop sustainability competencies. And what we did, for instance, in the exercises in the nanocellulose project were that at the beginning, these were more ideation-based, co-intuiting, co-envisioning exercises. So